Welcome, everyone. My name is Andrew Hooksema. I'm the Director of Regional Planning and Services at the Capital Area Council of Governments. For those of y'all who are not familiar with the Capital Area Council of Governments, I feel bad for you, but we are a regional planning agency. We're considered a political subdivision of the state. We cover 10 counties here in Central Texas, ranging east to west, from Llano County to Fayette County, and north to south, encompassing Williamson County and Hayes County. And in that role, I supervise the GIS program, and I also am our point of contact for the Census Bureau and the State Data Center. So I'm looking forward to this meeting. Looks like we should have about 50 to 60 people on here, so I'm not going to offer introductions for everybody on the call because that'd take up our whole meeting, but I will pass it off to our Census Bureau colleagues, and I'll pass it off to Jim Casaneri, and then he can introduce the other Census Bureau staff, and then go over some meeting logistics, and then we'll get into the presentations. So Jim, take it away.
Thanks, Andrew. Can you hear me okay? Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, we sure
Yep.
can. Yes.
Okay. You just never know these days, right? Well, thanks for that intro, Andrew, and thanks for hosting this meeting. First off, we had hoped we'd be in person for this meeting. And the design of this meeting is to have as much of a dialogue as possible. I realize that's not always easy. And I'm hearing my own feedback. Anyone else heard my feedback? Okay. With me today is Dorothy McKinney. She's a geographer from the Denver office. She's actually in Texas at the moment. Rosanna Mendoza is with us as well. I believe you're in Texas also, Rosanna. Rosanna worked the decennial census, and she's going to tell us a bit about that in a bit. And also with us is Lacey Lofton. She's a statistician with the Census Bureau, and we're going to be leveraging her skills quite a bit today as well. So Andrew, that's kind of my spiel for now. I'm going to kind of play a facilitator for the discussion once we get into it, but you have a few things to cover first. And let me pass it back to you.
Hey, Andrew, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, we're not hearing you.
Sorry. So I'll just to give you an overview of the meeting here, I'm going to provide a regional overview, about a 20-minute presentation on CAPCOG's data from the latest census and some of the new geographies that we'll be talking about today, and then turn it over to the Census Bureau staff. We'll talk about the Participant Statistical Area Program, which is the basis for tracts and block groups, and implications of the new census tracts for future census products and planning. Talk about the Boundary and Annexation Survey Program, census designated places. We'll take a 5-minute break because nobody wants to be sitting through a meeting for 3 hours straight. And then we'll come back, talk about a comparison of 2020 census results to 2020 evaluation estimates and a review of the annual estimate methodology. And then discussion of the count question resolution program, and then other topics and discussion that may come up. I will leave it to Jim and his staff as to how they want to field questions. I know one of the advantages of doing this in person would have been there might have been sort of more opportunity for give and take and a little bit better dynamics as far as interaction with participants. So I know there's a tendency on these virtual meetings to just kind of sit back and listen, but I do encourage y'all to ask questions and if you have a burning question but don't want to speak up, you can always write it in the chat box, and staff can come back to it. So with that, I'll move on. So just looking at the CAPCOG population over time. So again, we cover 10 counties here in Central Texas. And we added between 2010 and 2020 more people to our 10 county region's population than lived in the entire region in 1970, which I think is pretty remarkable. And even with our rate of growth slowing a bit, the actual number of people that we've added has continued to grow, as you can see there. So we added almost 600,000 people between 2010 and 2020. This growth was not uniform across the region. It was highly concentrated in mainly 3 counties, Travis, Hays, and Williamson counties, which are along the I-35 corridor. You can see the region as a whole grew by over 31%. We had 2 counties that were higher than that. Hays County at 53% was the fastest growing county in the state, and Williamson County at 44% was the 3rd fastest growing in the state. But you can see once you get to so Bastrop County was kind of right at the same level. But you had Travis County, where most of Austin is, grew at a slower rate, although still by far the largest number. But some of our more rural counties had much slower growth, or even in the case of Fayette County, showed a population decline. And we took a look, and if you look just at our region, that might seem like a surprising result. But if you zoom out and look at the whole state or look at the whole country, you do see a lot of rural areas that experience population decline. So, we talk a lot about the fast and explosive growth that we see in this region, and we do see that in some places. But it's important for us to remember that, the census also tells us that that's not the full story, and that there are parts of our community that are actually shrinking in terms of population as well. This just shows the growth rates for each of the counties compared to the state and the national average. And you can see we had 5 of our counties, the 5 in the Austin Round Rock metro area, that had growth rates that exceeded the state average. And then the other 5 had growth rates that were below the state average. The 10 largest cities, you can see the growth rates there, and all pretty robust growth. But particularly, you look at Leander, more than doubled in size from the last census to this one. But this is really significant growth in all of the largest cities in the region. We have also just some of the smaller communities that are growing extremely rapidly. You can see the growth rates here from 2010 to 2020 of the top 10 fastest growing cities, and you'll see that Leander is actually on both of these lists here, as is Buda. No, I'm sorry, Buda is not. We also have a number of cities that are shrinking, and so again, that's worth taking note of as well. One of the issues I know that came up with this last census was trying to make sense of how the census results compared to the Census Bureau's estimates that got released in the same year. So this is just a comparison of the estimates for April 1st, 2020 from the Census Bureau to the final census results for each county. And you can see that there's not much difference. That there's Bastrop County did have a 6.8% difference there, and Blanco County had a 6.9% difference in the other direction. But we're off maybe we're seeing differences of a few thousand here for on a county by county level, and as a region as a whole, it's pretty close to what the estimate was. But if we look at our top 10 cities, we see a pretty significant difference for a lot of them. So, you look at Austin, Round Rock, and Georgetown, each of those cities, their census results showed more than 10,000 people fewer than the estimates. And as a whole, these top 10 cities combined showed 83,000 people fewer than the estimate. There are a few cities you can see that the census actually showed higher results. So not all one direction, but it is a difference. And so what that suggests is that perhaps some of the population that we saw kind of at the county level that seemed to be on the mark, maybe some of that growth was occurring in unincorporated areas, but was being attributed to cities for whatever reason. One of the things the census can tell us is how many people live in cities versus unincorporated areas. So it's useful for us to kind of understand what each of our counties looks like in this regard. So the 3 I-35 counties, Hayes, Travis, and Williamson, all have populations that are primarily living in cities, whereas the rest of the 7 counties in the region have populations that primarily live in unincorporated areas. The census also tells us about housing occupancy rates, and one of the big issues in our region, as anyone who lives here knows, is the cost of housing these days. And occupancy rates are one of those, one of the factors that leads into this. So you can see very high housing occupancy rates in the metro, the 5 metro counties, lower occupancy rates out to the other, the east and west. And that's a reflection, that's reflected in housing costs as they vary across the state. I mean, the region as well. But what vacant means can also vary significantly community to community. So this is data from the 2015 and 2019 American Community Survey from the Census Bureau. And you can see that, you can use these data to analyze what are the characteristics of housing that is classified as vacant. So in Llano County, that's almost entirely dominated by seasonal, recreational, or occasional use. So we're talking second homes here in Llano County. So the occupancy rate you see in Llano County reflects the fact that a large number of housing units in Llano County are second homes or vacation homes. Whereas in Round Rock, for instance, it's more the case that you've got housing units that are for rent or for sale that are not currently occupied. So those are two very different pieces of information that if you just look at the census itself and aren't using other data products from the Census Bureau, you're not necessarily going to be getting the full picture on what's going on in housing in a community. So one of the things we'll talk about in today's meeting are the different geographies that the Census Bureau uses and provides data for. And so you can see there is a hierarchy for some of them. So census blocks nest into census block groups, which nest into census tracts, which nest into counties, states, and on up from there. But there are many other geographies that are of interest to us. So many of us work with cities or other geographies, school districts, for instance. So those don't nest perfectly into counties or census tracts or any of the other geographies. So they are tracked differently and data is available for them separately. But it's just useful to understand kind of how these different geographies are used and how they relate to one another. So for the CAPCOG region, this is just a comparison of how many tracts, block groups, and other geographies we had in the 2010 census versus the 2020 census. So we had almost exactly the same number of blocks. So I don't know, I'm sure the Census Bureau staff on here can tell you how they go about making decisions about when to add a new block or split a block, but you can see that's almost unchanged. Whereas the number of block groups and tracts has basically grown in line with population, and that's partly because tracts need to fit within a certain population parameter. We had 70 cities in the 2010 census and 71 cities in the 2020 census, although there is actually one city that had been incorporated as of the 2020 census that was not yet in the boundary and annexation survey. So the actual count of cities that existed was 72. And so this is one of the things we'll talk about today is participation in the boundary and annexation survey and why that's important for communities. We also had a rather significant change in the number of census designated places, which are not cities. They're unincorporated areas, but they have a sense of place. And so the Census Bureau designates these places as ways to collect and report data for them, so that anyone who wants to understand the characteristics of that community can do so without having to use something alternative like a census tract or block group or something like that. There were 23 urban areas following the 2010 census. We do not yet know how many urban areas there will be for the 2020 census. Jim tells me that the final rule on the criteria they're going to use should be out any day now, and they're looking to probably get the urban areas designated by midsummer, perhaps July of this year. Hang on a moment. So just, when we're talking about tracts and block groups, I find it useful to orient ourselves as to what we're talking about here. So, a block could be an actual city block. In the case of City of Austin and downtown Austin, you can see a lot of these blocks do in fact correspond to actual city blocks. And then, these blocks can group up into block groups, which then, group into census tracts. So there's usually, I don't know, 2 or 3 or 4 block groups in a tract, but there can be dozens and dozens of blocks in a particular block group. If you move to a medium-sized city like Kyle, same set of geographies that we're dealing with. We're dealing with tracts and block groups and blocks here, but it's a lot more spread out. There's a lot less density, and so a block might encompass a much larger area because it's just not developed in the way that it is in, say, downtown Austin. Whereas, in the more developed parts of Kyle, you can see that there are a lot more blocks and a lot denser block groups. And then this is another example here, City of Llano. You've got a single tract that roughly corresponds with the city limits, but also encompasses areas outside of the City of Llano. So, if you were trying to find information about the City of Llano and it was, the city data was not available, but the tract data was, you could look up the census tract for City of Llano and get a kind of an idea on what that data looks like for the city, although, it would not be exact. We do have, as I mentioned, we have new places that have been added for the 2020 census. That would include the City of Copeland and Williamson County, and then a number of census designated places, and you can read that list there. And this is just a map of these locations. So you can see they're kind of scattered around the area. There were quite a few in Bastrop County. I believe 4 of them were located in Bastrop County. There are some counties that didn't have any change in them. But what this does for the next 10 years then is allows these communities and anyone else working with data for these communities to get a better sense on what's going on in these places in a way that data at the tract or block level or county level would not be able to tell you. One of the other things that we encountered in looking at some of the census results is we discovered that there are, that the city limit files that we get every month from our counties as part of the 911 GIS updates. We did a comparison of that to the geographies for cities that the Census Bureau used last year, and we discovered that there were some notable differences. And we talked to staff at the City of Austin to try to figure out what was going on, and we came to find out that the data, the boundaries that the City of Austin uses includes both full purpose jurisdiction and limited purpose jurisdiction. And in the limited purpose jurisdiction, some but not all city authority extends there. They do issue building permits and so forth. And so, it's useful for us when we're talking about these geographies and comparing results for different geographies that we're talking about the actual same geography, or if we're not, what locations are we talking about? So, the city of Austin full purpose jurisdiction is something like 14% smaller than the size of the area that they used for the 2020 census. That includes the limited purpose jurisdiction. And this is just a map of Western Austin, and you can see address points that we identified that are in that full purpose jurisdiction, but outside the full purpose jurisdiction. And so understanding some of these nuances, I think can help us all get a better understanding of what we're looking at when we're interpreting Census Bureau data, and how these things are used when people are doing analysis. There were a number of cities that did not participate in the 2020 boundary and annexation survey. That doesn't mean their city limits weren't in there, except for Double Horn, which was not. It just means that whatever the last file the Census Bureau had on record would have been what they used. Now, sometimes city limits don't change year to year. And staff at these cities will still say, yep, nothing's changed, and that's recorded as participation. Sometimes it hasn't changed, and staff maybe just didn't submit anything because nothing changed. But there could also be situations where a boundary has changed, and it just didn't make it to the Census Bureau because of the reporting. So just to note that there were some cities that did not have participation in the 2020 boundary and annexation survey, so there is the possibility of some discrepancies there. A couple of issues just to note that CAPCOG's tracking, and then I'll turn it back over to Jim. Understanding why population estimates for some cities were so different from the 2020 census. Looking at tract level and block group level data over time. With the new geographies, one of the things that's going to happen is once we start getting the 2021, I guess, American Community Survey results, or 2020 American Community Survey results, the 5-year data, or any of the data that's kind of tracking over time, we're going to have an issue of being of trying to compare the data for the new geographies to the old geographies, because the new geographies are going to start to be used, and it's not going to be possible to necessarily easily figure out what the data for a particular tract now looks like compared to that same geography 5 years ago, if you're using different different tracts and different data for that. A big question mark is the impact of COVID on the American Community Survey data. We know that there were a lot of issues that the Census Bureau had to face in 2020 with their data collection efforts, and that's already had an impact on the release of some of the data. We'll see what that looks like moving forward, but a lot of people rely on the American Community Survey data, and so I know that there's a lot of concern about whether the new data is really going to be that useful, if we know that there's all these data collection issues, and really how to interpret some of that. One of the more specific issues I'm aware of is that there had been an effort to get Del Valley listed as a census designated place, and that did not happen. But in talking with Jim, it sounds like this is not necessarily just a once in a decade opportunity, and that there might be opportunities for this issue to be revisited, or for other communities to talk with the Census Bureau about this. So that's interesting to us. And then we're also very interested in seeing what comes out of the updated urban area boundaries and the impact on transit services, because of how urban area boundaries can affect eligibility for different types of transit funding. So That's it, and I'm going to now turn it back over to Jim.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Andrew.
Can you allow me to share my screen? And where do I do that on this end?
It's on the top. If you go over to the right by the leave button, there's a button for share content, and you should be able to click that.
Oh, yeah.
And then
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Give me just a sec here. Okay, let's try that again. What are you guys seeing now? Try it one more time. Can you see
We
a?
can see your slides, but
we
it's
can
not.
we can see your screen.
Yeah,
Okay.
we're seeing your whole.
Yeah, sorry, I tried to do a present mode, and I'm working with a setup here that I haven't used before, so I'm going to let you see the standard mode here. I apologize to you for that, but rather than fight with it in front of you, I'm just going to go with what I've got here. So let me kind of explain one of the reasons why we're talking today. And Andrew, thanks for a great job outlining some of the demographic and geographic changes for the Austin metro area. Dorothy and I, Lacey and Rosanna, have all been working on decennial efforts and other parts of census programs for a while now. And now that the 2020 census has passed us, I think many of us, both within the census and outside of census, are looking back thinking, what happened? Quite a bit happened, obviously. So I've got some very, very simple slides here with no content on them. The intent here is that each of these slides represent a topic of discussion. Originally, when we planned this meeting, we were going to be meeting with you in person, and we would have a whiteboard to draw thoughts on and have dialogue back and forth. I'd like to try to attempt to do that today as much as we can. So if you have a question that's related to the immediate topic of discussion, please put it in the chat. My colleagues will keep an eye out there, and as they see them and call them out, we'll ask them to address those questions as they come. What I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of play facilitator here for many of these topics. I'm going to ask my colleagues to talk about them based on their expertise. As we move through a couple of these slides, and you can see I've got about 10 of them coming here, we're going to try to address all the issues that you saw in the agenda. And Andrew, I'm going to ask you to kind of chime in when it's time to take a break so that we can get everybody a little bit of a breather from this dialogue. But again, we hope this afternoon we paint a picture of not just the decennial process, what it was, what happened, the way it works, but also some of the other things that we do when we're not taking a decennial census. So really, to start off, I'd like to ask Rosanna to talk about the 2020 census. Many of you know Rosanna. She worked for us in our partnership outreach effort. And Rosanna, would you take a few minutes just to comment on the 2020 census and your role, if you don't mind?
Thank you. Everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. So as Jim said, my name is Rosanna Mendoza, and I was part of the efforts out of the Denver-Dallas region working with the partnership program. The partnership component of the 2020 census was an integration of two programs, the Census Bureau National Partnership Program, which was run primarily out of headquarters, and the Community Partnership and Engagement Program, or CPAP, that was run through the districts within the U.S. I was the coordinator for the CAPCOG area, so many people on this call would have likely engaged with some of the staff members that formed the partnership community program that we had going on in your area. Our job was to recruit partners to engage their community to participate in the 2020 census count. In the midst of COVID, of course, everybody was challenged to get that participation up. We were looking for what we call high response, self-response rates, meaning that people would respond to the census on their own, either through receiving information at a mailer or perhaps attending one of our events, rather than having census people knock on your door. We understand that at self-participation, a high self-participation rate means better data, more increased participation, also cuts down costs for us. I was looking at the slides that Andrew showed up earlier before, and Williamson County had one of the highest self-response rates in the nation. So to see that growth and to see a high self-response rate of 70.9% self-response, meaning people before we knocked on the doors at 70.9% were responding to the census, that is tremendous. Overall, the partnership program for the Denver-Dallas region was successful in increasing census participation. Overall, we had about 1,500 events and meetings. We had an additional 1,100 meetings virtually. We had more than 900 data awareness presentations after the partnership program was winding down. About 40 to 42% of these meetings and outreach functions were held through state, city, county government partnerships. So your participation in the census and your ability to mobilize community groups and citizen participation really drove the numbers to a real good point of compliance and participation for the census.
Rosanna, you still out there?
Yes, here I am. Yes.
Was that your intro for us?
That was it. It was a challenge. It was especially, we had the most challenge with what Andrew was talking about, those high growth counties. Hayes County, real challenge to get out there and get the participation. And observations of the higher education community, once COVID hit and spring break, students didn't come out, come back to the schools in dorm housing. That was a challenge for us as well.
Thanks, Rosanna. You and I have worked together over the last few years trying to tackle some of the geographic programs. Dorothy was with us, as well as Lacey on a number of these issues. I want to introduce a couple of the concepts, and then I'm going to ask Lacey to talk a little bit about some differences, the DDS program, and then some differences about some of our data. But let me mention just a little bit here. I think one of our challenges at Census is that we struggle to maintain context with all of you from year to year. Of course, the decennial census is a huge effort, and with folks like Rosanna, we make extra effort through outreach to gain the participation of everyone in the decennial effort. But of course, we're doing a lot of things year to year. And so I have a bullet up here called The Other 9 Years, and you're going to hear about some of the things that happened the other 9 years. Those of us who are on the call with you now are career staff. We work year to year on a variety of things. Dorothy and I being geographers, we work on geography. Lacey is a statistician, works on all kinds of things related to data. And Rosanna has been working on some of our enumeration, post-enumeration effort. My point in all of that is the 2020 is done and we've moved past that. We'll talk a little bit about some post-census programs that are out there that you might have an interest in. But we're moving ahead. And one of the things we want to do is try to maintain a connection with all of you, a dialogue, maintain that dialogue. So we're going to talk about some of these things that happened before the census, things that are happening now, things that will happen just afterwards, and how they relate to you and your jobs, because we've heard a lot about that, a lot of questions about why do population estimates look different than decennial counts? Why did census tracts change? Why can't I have a CDP right now? There are a whole bunch of questions out there we hope to try to address with this dialogue here this afternoon. So let me cover a couple other basics here. There are 6 regional offices that have staff working and conducting a variety of surveys, dozens of surveys, month to month, year to year, in addition to the decennial census. And Denver is the office that works with Texas. We had an office in Dallas during the decennial census, the Regional Census Center. Dorothy and I were there, and Rosanna was working out of there as well. Now that office is closed, the Denver Regional Office manages 12 states, including Texas. There are 5 other regional offices where regional staff manage surveys and deal with a variety of other issues related to surveys and censuses. You heard a little bit about the partnership outreach from Rosanna, which was a huge effort, one of the largest ever in the history of the Bureau, to try to gain that contact, that outreach to local governments. That was a big effort, but there was a little bit of confusion about how that partnership might continue. And so in just a second, I'm going to ask Lacey to talk a little bit about data dissemination and how we continue that outreach and how we continue to make contact with local governments to help everyone understand the data. So Lacey, I'm going to ask you to take a few minutes to talk about that. I'm going to come back in just a minute, but I'm going to highlight the slide that has nothing on it. It gives you plenty of room to talk.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Yeah, I really appreciate all the outline you provided here. Thank you.
Yes.
So guys, first of all, thank you so much for having us. I was really hoping to get to see everybody in person for the first time in a really long time, and then it didn't work out. So at least we're doing this. As Jim mentioned, I'm a data dissemination specialist, so we're back up to about 30. We were kind of short-staffed during the decennial census. We're getting our staff back after they were on different projects temporarily. I cover most of Texas. I also just found out I cover Kansas and New Mexico. So we're kind of throughout the region. We cover whatever needs to be covered. We unfortunately are not traveling at the moment, but we're expecting that to change soon. So if there's a conference, if there's a meeting, something like this, something like the Texas GIS Forum or the state data center meetings, we're your resource there. We're also a resource if you just need to understand what's going on in your community. If you're looking on our website and get stuck, I'm always available to help you understand what is available and how to best access it. In theory, I'm supposed to be more of an expert in the areas that I cover. Usually, most of all our stuff is available online. It's publicly available. It's semi-consistent across different states, but that's our role. I think our contact information is in here as well. But if you need any data, understand the programs, understand where the data comes from, understand if you're using it correctly, which are some of the questions we handle most. I'm your girl for that. And Jim, since I had the floor and there was nothing else really on the slide, Jeffrey and Dorothy, I saw you responded about Airbnbs. So what I've learned I just started my 19th year with the Census Bureau. What I've learned in the last 19 years is that this country is so unique and there are so many unique situations within it. So it's very hard to answer that question. The question was, are Airbnbs counted as recreational or seasonal? And it really depends on a lot of situations around them. So if it's a normal residence that somebody just rents out on the weekend, it's going to be different than if somebody is living there just very occasionally and renting it out almost all the time. In some ways that would be treated like a hotel. And just, hey, Joseph, can you please be quiet? My 5-year-old is home in isolation for 10 days, and he's actually being fabulous. He's over there playing with the truck. But so it just really depends on literally who owns it, what the structure is, what the rental structure is. And if you want me to, I can send you a really specific document on how that kind of, it's basically a tree to figure out how each individual one would apply. But there's just so many different ways those are not only legally set up, but how they're physically occupied, that it depends on the situation. That's all I have, Jim. I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about a lot of different things as we go forward. But if there's anything else that you specifically want me to touch on, I'm happy to do so at this time too.
Yes, absolutely. Because funny, with 12 states, there's a distinct commonality among a lot of the questions that are coming out. And one of those that's been common throughout all of our states is that, hey, census, Jim, you just published a census result for our city, and it looks very different from the ACS estimates and way different from the population estimates. And that's a little inconvenient.
Especially in
folks in
Central Texas. It's been such a
Yes.
fast growing population. It's been, we are not covering boring areas, which at least keeps us on our
No. We just had an email this morning from a guy in Montana who wants us to talk about that. He wrote a very specific question about, can you help us GIS people understand the differences between decennial data, ACS data, and population estimates program? And Lacey and I actually had quite a long conversation with the population estimates folks a number of weeks ago, maybe it was months ago now. And I thought it was very interesting.
4 or 5 months ago. It was not
Yeah,
recent.
well, it's been a while.
It's been a bit.
Anyway, I wondered, Lacey, if you might take a moment to talk about those 3 bullets there and how they're different and what people should be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is, and especially once a decade, this is when these questions come up the most. So I'll just give you a really high level overview of these 3 different programs. Okay. Of these programs, and then I'll stop and ask questions and take questions. So the decennial census is the once a decade big show that we put on. This is literally a head count. So you either are responding online, you're responding with paper, you're responding on the phone. So it's a head count. It has very few data points. There's really only 5 main data points that come from it. But we can tell you down to that block level, which I know we're going to talk about too, exactly where people live. We can also tell you their age, race, ethnicity, do they rent or own their home, and their sex. So it's just those 5 main data points, but we can tell you where they're living on April 1st. So it's just that day, that's the reference day of a year ending in 0. So pretty straightforward. The American Community Survey actually is still part of the decennial census program. It has evolved over time. We have computers now, which I'm finally getting to that point in my career when I'm like, back when I started, and this is actually true, we still had like carbon paper. We had a typewriter in the front office for badges. It was pretty epic, which I'm sure is like vintage now. But because we were able to process data so much more quickly, so we used to have, for the decennial census, 1 in 6 households would get a really long form called the long form. That was all the way through 2000. Because we were able to tabulate data more quickly, we separated that long form into a separate program, and now we're doing it every month in every county or county equivalent across the country. That's the American Community Survey. So it's kind of an offshoot of the decennial census. Because it is part of the decennial census program, it is still required by law. It has a really high percentage response rate. It is a very big survey, even though it is just a survey. So we go to 3.5 million households a year. And we're able to produce data down to a very small geography for the 5-year data from the American Community Survey. So first we have a complete census, which is a complete head count. Sorry. So the decennial census is a complete head count. The American Community Survey is a sample. It's a big sample, but it's still a sample. And then the population estimates program is kind of a different animal in itself. So this population estimates program will start with the decennial census numbers, and will bring in different data. So we'll have births and deaths, internal and external migration. Births, deaths, internal, external migration. those are the main ones. And so we'll use that base and calculate off of that. And so we'll produce an annual population estimate for every place in the country, which is, I think, what most of you use that data for. But it is actually a calculation. So it is not, the result of a sample or, a survey or a census. It is an actual, it's something we do with modeling, basically. Does anybody have any questions about those? I know it's confusing, especially when the decennial census comes out in some different numbers. They don't match up perfectly. They're never going to. The truth is they're not designed to. It would be great if in a perfect world, we were perfect at, we could have a perfect projection or we could have a perfect estimate. That's not the case. So the reason the numbers are different really when it comes down to it is the methodologies behind them are different. What questions do we have? Okay, so I see a question that I don't quite understand. Hi, Lila, first of all. Good to see you. Do you want to unmute yourself and tell me a little bit more about what you're looking for here?
Sure. Yeah, one of the things I find really interesting is that even though they're all very different, right, they still rely on each other for controls, right? So ACS, I think maybe even to the county level, controls to the population estimates. And then the population estimates, like you said, starts with the decennial. And so they're all kind of at some point like intermingled, right?
Yeah, we try to make it as absolutely complicated as possible. And you're absolutely right. So and it was even more unique this year because the population estimates were released before some of the stuff that we usually use the decennial census from the decennial census. So Lila's absolutely right. Again, if you really want to get into the weeds, it's actually like, it's not that, it's like a 4-page, we've got like a 4-page overview of how those kind of rely on each other, but it can get into a lot of specifics. But we love to check our work against ourselves, and we do that consistently. And that's actually one of our big releases is, when we start looking at projections and population with our different surveys and compare them to see how we're doing. We use them as a measure to see how accurate we are in different ways. Sure, so the next question I have is how often is the population estimate data refreshed? So that's just annually. And this next one is a great question, and I really wish we had a whiteboard for this. I miss my whiteboards. So the difference between 1-year ACS data and 5-year ACS data. This is a really big topic that I don't feel like gets enough attention. I think sometimes people just use whatever happens to be laying around. From a very high level, we are able to publish American Community Survey data, 1-year data. So for example, the 2021 data that we just released, 2020 data, all my years are running together. The 2020 data that we just released is it's every household we sampled from January 1st with a reference date of January 1st to December 31st of 2020. Now it takes us all the way through March of 2021 to actually finish capturing all that data and then start analyzing it. So we'll release it towards the end of 2021. So the 2020 ACS 1-year data includes all the households that we sampled in 2020. The 5-year data is actually an aggregate of the 5 previous years. So we've got for 2020, which will be released in March. We're delayed on that because of a whole lot of coronavirus related issues. Pandemics are really fun for releasing data. So we will actually include 2020, 2019, 2018, 2017, and 2016. So all 5 years, every household that we sampled in those 5 years will be included in that. Why this matters is for the 1-year data, for the vast majority of places, we are only able to publish that data if they are at 65,000 population or higher. That is because if you get smaller than that, we start risking disclosing information about individuals or households, especially with people's ability to go back and combine other data and kind of back build our data. So 1-year data is released for everywhere that is 65,000 or more, with the exception of MSAs. We'll publish ACS data, 1-year ACS data for metropolitan statistical areas that are 50,000 people or more. Now, the 5-year data, because we have a much more vast, we have a much bigger sample, because we're combining that longer period of time, we will try to publish down to the block group level. So it goes down to a much, much smaller geographic level. So the 1-year ACS is going to be more timely. So it's going to be, you're looking at what really happened over the last year. The 5-year data is going to be more accurate. There are more households sampled. There are more data points. So the margin of error is going to be lower. But depending on where you live, let's say you lived in New Orleans post-Katrina, you'll know your area well enough to know which data point is better for you. If you're somewhere where it's not 65,000 or more, the 5 year is going to be your probably only option. I know that that's complicated, and I wish I could draw it out. What questions do you guys have follow up there? The only other caution I'll throw out, because I've done this to myself over and over again, no matter how many years I tell myself I'm going to learn my lesson this one last time. If you're going to be comparing a data set to a lot of other data sets, or you want to build on this, you want to have different ways to look at it. 5 year data is always the safest. One of my pet peeves that I do to myself is I'll use 1 year data for something, and then I'll want to compare it to a zip code or something that's smaller, and we won't have the 1 year data available for it. And you really shouldn't be comparing 1 year and 5 year data. It's just not a statistically sound thing to do. So if this is something you're going to be using in a lot of ways, 5 year data is definitely the most safe because we produce it for so many different geographies. If you want the most timely data, the 1 year data is a great option too. And specifically in Texas and Central Texas, there are a lot of places that are bigger than 65,000. In some audiences, we've been places where I don't know where the closest geography with that many people was, but that's a quick recap of the two.
Thanks, Lacey. I'm going to let your voice take a short break and draw a little parallel to that. And I wonder how many of you know this about the community development block grants, the CDBGs that are offered by HUD. I did not know this myself until about a month ago. My assumption was all along that CDBG grants are made available by the decennial census count, population count by jurisdiction. And I discovered after an inquiry a few months back that that's no longer the case. How many of you knew or were aware that is now the ACS data that is used as the foundation for that determination? And that was news to me. I'd assumed it was the decennial count. And communicating with HUD over the last several weeks, I've discovered there are several other grant and funding programs that are now based on the ACS and not the census count. So if you weren't aware of that, you might check into some of the programs that you're familiar with to see what baseline they're using for their awards of their grants. I intend to learn a little bit more about that. So let's move forward here. Any other questions before we jump to some new topics? As always, we're watching the chat. If you do have thoughts or questions, please post them in there. So if I could spend just a moment on, can you also, hopefully you can still see my screen there. There are three bullets here to try to put the rest of what we're going to talk about today into some context. Again, back to one of the comments I made earlier, one of the biggest concerns I have as a geographer, and I know Lacey and Dorothy and Rosanna share this concern, is that we want to make sure local governments and affiliated agencies have a firm understanding of census data and how the census works to really better our communities. This is what it's all about. It's not just about reapportionment. We really want to make the world better, this country better. And census, that's what it's all about. But to do that effectively, we need to understand how it works. And I really only have come to this conclusion recently. I think it's sometimes too easy just to sit inside your box and not look outside to see what other folks are seeing. But let me put these three bullets into context. There are programs that the Census Bureau offers, and I'm speaking primarily now as a geographer. Some of us geographers feel pretty strongly about our programs, right, Dorothy? There are some pre-census programs that are about geography that help the census count. There are post-census programs, and they're not all geography programs, but many of them are. There are post-census programs that help with the count and other data dissemination efforts. And then there are annual efforts that collect data year to year. So some of these topics, what we're going to talk about here in the next minutes, will be post-census, some will be pre-census, and some will occur annually. And so I've tried to break them out into those
it's
categories.
Like a game show, just like a really dorky game show.
Yes, thank you. So Lacey, any comments there before I ask Dorothy?
I'm looking forward to seeing where you guys are going with this.
We don't know, that's just it. Actually, Dorothy. So you can see my bullets here, and Dorothy has worked with all of these programs. I thought you might take a few minutes to talk to us about these programs that are pre-census in nature and how they might have a bearing on a good count for local governments.
Sure. So we'll just go down the list here. So redistricting data, I think that one is pretty straightforward as to why it matters and why it's important. The block boundary suggestion program is, and really it's kind of an early stage in the redistricting data program, and that's how we fix blocks that have weird boundaries. So that's kind of one of those things where it only comes around every 10 years. So when you notice that you see something weird and it's not something that we can fix, you want to take note and make sure that that's in the pipeline for the next go around. So the next one is the one that I worked on the most, and probably I see a lot of familiar names. So I'm sure many of you had the pleasure of working with me on PSAP in 2020. I'm kidding, of course. I think the CAPCOG area, we actually had a really great PSAP. It may not have seemed like it at the time, but I think we got a lot of really important things done during PSAP. I know in Travis County, we desperately needed to renumber some tracks. And we were able to do that for 2020, and that was kind of a big thing. So that bodes well for upcoming censuses. I know Andrew mentioned before something about comparability of tracks and how going forward that's going to be maybe hard or something that we need to be careful about because the geographies have changed. Kind of along the lines of, we did a great PSAP in CAPCOG. I think I can say that we really had great splits. I took a look today actually at the 2020 data, and most of the tracks in the CAPCOG area are in the kind of goalpost population threshold. So for the most part, I don't actually think there will be too many comparability issues. There are those series of tracks that were renumbered. But other than those, I think generally we had pretty reasonable splits that did the main job, which is to keep those tracks about the same population. I know we had some CDP concerns, and I know Jim mentioned that, you know, basically watch this space. There might be something going on with that. We're not totally sure yet, but I would say in the case of Del Valle, definitely reach out to us, and we can definitely see what there is for us to do moving forward with that. Luca, kind of the same thing. We had a lot of participation in the capital area, so I don't have much to say about that other than that Luca is really, really important for helping us to capture some of those addresses that are a little harder to capture, like maybe non-traditional housing. We do get addresses from the post office, so mailable addresses are usually something we acquire through other means, but Luca, again, very important for those things that kind of can fall through the cracks, like new construction, things that maybe wouldn't have been captured in our most recent post office address list. So that's another one where there's things you can kind of do now to start prepping for that, because those addresses, you know, you need a good E911 system or some type of system to make sure you're maintaining those addresses that we can actually use. So new construction, kind of the same thing as local updated census addresses. I just kind of joke it's the mini Luca. It's where right before we do the big count, we say, okay, here's your last chance. Is there anything that's going to be completed by census day that we haven't recorded yet from you? Maybe that was just built, i.e. new construction, and we can go ahead and add that kind of as a provisional address to check out. So that's kind of my overview of pre-census programs. So I'll hand it back to Jim.
Thanks, Dorothy. Was there a question in the chat?
Yeah, so there are two. So one addresses, and I'm happy to take the first one. Roy was asking about census blocks and census tracts that often cut across jurisdictional boundaries. And Jim can talk to this in more specifics, but in theory, a block shouldn't, I mean, depending on if it's a boundary that we recognize, whether it's political or legal, because, and actually, Jim, I'm going to let you take that one over, because of the way the Tiger's set up, the block would have to end at the same place that the jurisdiction does, right? Even if it's political, like that is a requirement within the system, right?
That's correct, yes.
So as long as it's a geography that we actually have, that shouldn't be the case. But specifically for census tracts, because we get this question a lot, especially when new data is released based on new census tracts. Census tracts really are statistical geography that are maintained and controlled by the Census Bureau, and they are very much supposed to act outside of any political influence or geography. And that sounds more dramatic than it is. We will certainly be, publishing data for places forever, and we'll be, publishing data down for different legal and political geographies. Statistical geographies, which are blocks, block groups, tracts are your biggest ones, and then there's a couple other less used statistical areas. They really are supposed to be separate. What's nice about them is they're all about the same population size, so they're semi-normalized by themselves, so you can compare them more easily spatially. They also are consistent over time, where a place can change a boundary at whim, and they do. There's a lot of places that change, zip codes change all the time, city boundaries change all the time. At least we attempt to keep the outer boundaries of the census tracts the same. So even if we have to split them up over the years, and Jim, I don't know if you've got that slide deck or if you want me to pull that up about how census tracts are split. But even if we have to split them over the years to get them down, I can pull it up to about 4,000 people. Those outside boundaries stay the same. And because those outside boundaries stay the same for tracts, you're able to go back and compare over time because you can recreate the original geography. So that is why, very much on purpose, census tracts are completely separate than political geographies. I know that can still be very frustrating. And sometimes they end up being the same just because there are similar reasons that they were both created that way. But often, and I don't know if it's just because I spend my time here, it feels like ours are political geographies here are really unique. So census tract in most cases won't follow those same boundaries. And then Jim, I want to throw this one at you. There's a GAO report that's mentioned here, and I don't think we're going to be able to get into it, but there were some suggestions apparently made for LUCA. I don't know what those are, but do you know of any discussions about changes in LUCA going forward for the 2030 census? Because it's kind of crazy. We're not that far away from it. I feel like we just wrapped up the last one, and we're really not that far from LUCA for 2030. So.
No, I haven't seen that, and I don't know if you've seen it, Dorothy.
I haven't read it yet either, so I'm not sure we'll be able to make a good comment on what those recommendations are. But
okay.
Yeah,
other
Monica,
questions?
if you have specific questions, you can always reach out to us about those.
So we're about an hour in. I thought we might go for a few more minutes before we take a break, but we are making good headway. For those of you who are not riveted to the screen, we don't have a whole lot of topics scheduled to discuss, but we certainly will have plenty of time for questions and answers in just a few minutes. I'd like to address these 4 bullets here that are categorized under our post-census programs. Now, hopefully you know these are not all programs that the Census Bureau does. These are just a select few that have direct relevance on a good census count and on how local governments can interact with the Census Bureau regarding those counts. The redistricting data program, there was a block boundary suggestion program, a bullet that Dorothy talked about a little earlier. The result of that effort, the block boundaries, as well as the integration of election precincts and congressional districts from states, is the Public Law 94171 data release, or the redistricting data release, which occurred in August of last year. That is the redistricting data that allows for the reapportionment of the 435 seats in Congress. It's very fundamental data from the decennial census. It's not a much larger cross tabulation. It's the first data product. It's out there. It's down to the block level. And if you're not familiar with it, it's the most detailed, complete data as a count from the census. And I know there are additional products that will come out later. I think it's this year, Lacey. I'm not sure. Is it the DHC? Is that the additional data that's coming? I don't know what we're calling it. The demographic housing characteristics come out, I think,
First,
this
you
year.
just asked me, and now I'm completely blanking. Give me a second. Come back to me.
They changed the name of it on us.
Every 10 years, just to mess with us, they change the names just a little bit.
It was used to be the STF, summary tape file, and they called it that for a long time, and they realized, hey, we don't have tapes anymore, so we'll call it summary files. And now they dropped that name because we can't name anything the same every 10 years. Anyway, we'll come back to Lacey with more on that. I want to mention oh, look here, I put county. I want to mention the count question resolution operation, the CQR. This is an operation that allows local governments and those who are on the call today or on the conference today who are representing a local government, you probably are aware of it. The CQR is an opportunity to review and contest your decennial counts with the Census Bureau. If you don't know anything about that and you'd like to learn more, reach out to Dorothy or I. We'd be glad to help you. It's been mentioned a few times that the urbanized area delineation will be occurring shortly. That should come out around July of this year. And if you weren't aware, there was a very big change in the criteria for UAs. We went from a population criteria threshold to a housing-based criteria threshold. Whole lot of debate going on out there in the internet after we published those criteria in the Federal Register. The last bullet that I can throw out at you is our zip code tabulation areas, the ZICTAs as we call them. And probably you all are aware they're based on zip codes, but they're not official zip codes. They're representations of zip codes using census geography. So those are some post-census geographic programs that have a bearing on the data and the releases of the data. And there are many others. Comments or questions on that?
It was the DHC, and then there's a detailed DHC. So you had the acronym right. Nailed it.
I was hoping I did. Good. All right. Dorothy, Rosanna, any comments on this slide before I move to the next?
Hi, everyone. I have a comment. Sorry about that.
No comment, Jim, from Rosanna.
Is there an echo? Hello, can y'all hear me? This is Monica Cruz.
Hi, Monica.
Hi, I'm at the Texas Demographic Center and just wanted to, and I'll post this in the chat, but the Texas Demographic Center is the state data center for Texas, and we will be hosting a CQR webinar next week on Thursday. I'll be posting a flyer that'll have registration for you to attend that next Thursday on the 27th. So just wanted to let you know.
Excellent, thank you. I had to struggle and fight with my mouse to get it from one screen to the other. It's like it gets trapped by the boundaries of the screen, and I'm not sure why, but I was able to get it over and click on the unmute. So let me bring up another slide with a couple of bullets related to some annual programs that are ongoing. There's one on the list here, that second bullet, that's probably not too well known, and that's primarily because this program, the school district program, is run at the state level. The Census Bureau works with each and every state to update annually its school district representations. And if you represent a school district or you work with school district data, you're probably aware of that. It's one of those relatively unknown programs that we work with every year. Perhaps the biggest program that's worth talking about is the Boundary Annexation Survey. This is an annual effort And it technically is a survey that has a geographic component to it. We reach out to all functional governments asking for changes to your political boundaries. This is an opportunity not only to record changes in your jurisdictional boundaries due to annexations or de-annexations perhaps, but also changes in names. That happens every now and then. So it's about changes to boundaries and names. And it also is supposed to capture new jurisdictions. And I've had conversations with a few of you about those challenges and how we're working through that with Texas and some other states to ensure that Census Bureau is aware of those new incorporations that are out there that don't know they should be sending a map showing their boundaries and their official name to the Census Bureau so that we can tabulate the data for that. And it's certainly true that every year as we conduct this BAS, those new boundaries that are incorporated, we will retabulate the data based on the geocodes of the information that we have to provide a more accurate or updated, rather, tally of the data. So, Lacey, any thoughts on that?
No, so I was gonna say after the break, I think it would be a good place to start. Come back and walk through. Give me a second to get the track splits up so we can talk about that briefly. And then, as Jim said earlier, I mean, really the reason we're here, and again, it would be nice if it was in person, is to answer any questions. So you guys are a really involved group, and you were really involved through the entire process. And we've had a lot of questions after, so we just wanted to be here as a resource. So that really is why we're here. Jim, if you want to go to break, I will pull up the track split so we can at least touch on how you can use data over time and how the tracks change. And Andrew, did you have anything else that we have not touched on yet that you specifically, I wrote a list and now we've been going a million miles an hour. Is there anything else that we've completely flown over that you want to make sure we go back to?
I'd like you maybe to go back to talking about census designated places and, you know, city limits are a little bit more straightforward than figuring out what constitutes a place. And maybe y'all could talk a little bit about, you know, what are the things y'all look at? What does that process look like? You know, the discussion we had the other month about, you know, is it really just a once every 10-year opportunity, or are there opportunities to do that more frequently? Another thing maybe that just you know, going back to the discussion about the different data products, the population estimates, you know, you mentioned that if you get new boundaries, you will basically retabulate data with the new boundaries. And so maybe if you could touch on, for instance, a situation in which a new city limit gets established, or you become aware of a new city limit, how does that affect, you know, the population estimates, because the population estimates that y'all release are not just for that year, they're also, you know, back. It includes an updated estimate for every year going back to the census.
Okay. Yep.
And then,
so Andrew,
I mean, the other thing I would add is just if you could talk a little bit more about the methodology that's used for the particularly how you get from county level to place level for the estimates, because that, you know, as you saw in the slides that I showed, we seem to have fairly good agreement at the county level, but then there seem to be the kind of rather large differences, particularly for our top 10 cities in terms of the population counts versus the estimates.
And the truth is on that one, and I'll just give you the spoiler alert here, we don't do a whole lot to differentiate between what falls within a place and what doesn't when we do our estimates. But I can also certainly touch on that, and I can send, we've got a document that explains it in excruciating detail, or lack thereof, depending on your view on it. But okay, awesome. Do you guys want to do the 5-minute break? I will get that PowerPoint over to you, Jim. You can walk through that, and then we'll go from there.
Sure.
Okay, and if you guys have any questions, put them in the chat, and we will keep working through those too.
See y'all back here at 2:50. Jim, are you all ready to get started again?
You betcha.
Hey, Jim, do you want to start on bass and then
Sure. Sure. Let's talk bass. I've also got a tracked example ready to show.
I was gonna say, I've actually got that PowerPoint if you want to walk through it kind of quickly later, the whole thing. I don't know how much time we'll have since we've got.
I've got that. We did an understanding statistical geography about a year ago or so. I've got that in front of me here.
Okay.
So bass, we had more questions about it. Can I get some more information on what we're interested in knowing about bass?
It sounded like Lila wanted just kind of an overview of, what 2022 bass looks like.
Okay. Well, I'll run through. I'll run through a quick. I'll do a quick rundown on how bass works, and as I go through that, if there are additional questions, please put them in chat there. The way bass works is that each year the Census Bureau announces the program to all governments that we have record for, all functioning governments. This is cities, counties, and we actually notify the states as well. Although it'd be highly unusual if a state boundary changes, it does happen every now and then. Usually it's a legal clarification, but our primary targets for the bass are cities, city equivalents, counties, and county equivalents. This is for the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and the continental and 50 states of the United States. So all governments within the confines of the United States are eligible to participate. We send emails. We used to send letters. I still say that sometimes. But what we do now is we send an email to every highest elected official for each government that we have a record for. Basically, it's like a postcard that says bass is coming. We mail these late December or early January of every year, and on that postcard, we actually still send a few postcards to some governments. And in the email, there is a unique identifier for every government. It's a code that's assigned to each government. And we ask them to reply to the Census Bureau to say, no, we don't have any changes. Our boundaries are just the same this year as they were last year. And if we get that, we treat that as a response. But obviously, we also get responses that say, yes, we have changes. Those changes can be provided to the Census Bureau in the form of a paper map for those smaller governments that don't have GIS or Geographic Information System capabilities. The primary and preferred method is via Geographic Information Systems. Governments have the option of doing their editing using their own GIS system with a series of guidelines that we publish. They also have the ability to use a piece of open source software that has been enhanced to work with our boundary survey. We call it GUPS, the Geographic Update Program software. And the GUPS runs off of QGIS. If you're familiar with that, that's open source software. The process involves utilizing Census Bureau Tiger data. And it involves making changes to the existing boundary to the point to where it matches as closely as possible the boundary of the local government. And then what you end up submitting to us is a change file, a shape, if you will, to borrow the language of the Esri folks, that shows just the differences between what the census has and what you show as a local government. If it is an annexation, the Census Bureau asks that you also include the legal documentation that shows that your jurisdiction had legally filed all of the correct documentation to make those changes. And that is referenced when we make the changes in Tiger. We learned a hard lesson a number of years ago when we were making bass changes without the legal documentation. So that's a requirement. If it's a correction, but not a change, we don't have to have legal documentation for that. One of the best ways a government can decide whether or not they need to do a BAS change or a BAS correction is to review our boundaries at the Census Bureau. And the easiest way to do that without actually going through the process of loading data into a GIS is using our Tiger Web software. It's a data viewing tool that runs within a web browser. And if you do an internet search for Tiger Web, Census Tiger Web, that's one word, TIGER WEB, no spaces, you will find our viewer that allows you to review all kinds of census and census geography, including incorporated places. There are 2 deadlines associated with BAS. There's a March 1st deadline and a May 30th. Did I get those right, Dorothy? Sometimes I switch those dates out.
Yeah, May 31st, but
Thank
close
you.
enough.
Okay. Those dates are relevant because they allow us to insert the changes in time for the boundaries to be reflected in our ACS data release. So if you return your boundary change before the first deadline, the Census Bureau has the time to not only insert those boundaries into our Tiger system, but tabulate data based on the new boundaries. If you miss that first line, but still get it into us before May 1st, we're able to make those changes in Tiger, but we are not able to retabulate the data before the next releases for the ACS. So those deadlines are in place for that reason, primarily. The BAS boundaries should be submitted to us based on what was official as of January 1st. That's true regardless of the decennial census or the subsequent and following BAS years. So it's always January 1st. If you have an official incorporation that occurs after January 1st, it has to wait until the next year's BAS cycle to be inserted into Tiger. Dorothy, what did I miss there?
I think you covered it all. So you can participate now. I guess that's the one thing. If you haven't responded, you can still respond. We just started BAS, so.
Hey, Jim, do you want to talk a little bit, because I think it's kind of on the same topics. Do you guys want to touch on how important the BAS was right before the 2020 census and what happens? I know there was one incorporation after the fact, and kind of touch on how that plays out.
Sure. So we recognize that the BAS is critically important for an accurate tabulation. And Lacey and I have this long history of working together, and our favorite tools for these types of dialogues is a whiteboard, because you really oftentimes need a physical way to diagram what it is you're talking about. And if maybe I was a little more adept at virtual meetings, I might be able to draw and paint or something. The issue that I want to convey regarding that concern is that the data that we collect for the decennial census and the data that we maintain and collect for surveys is all geocoded. Every response is geocoded to a city street, essentially. Much of that work is done beforehand. The Census Bureau maintains what we call the master address file. And this, theoretically, is a list of every residential address in the country. And that address, if it's stored correctly and we believe it has the correct information, will have a latitude longitude associated with it. And that's a very accurate latitude longitude. We're storing that to 7 significant digits after the decimal. That gets us down to centimeter accuracy if we have it. And I should say, if that information is provided to us from a local government in a very high accurate format, we maintain that accuracy. And there's a whole separate dialogue about accuracy of geographic data, and I won't get into that. The point I'm making is that all of our responses are geocoded to a location on the ground. If that location is wrong, or that location falls outside of a boundary because the boundary is wrong, the tabulation is going to be wrong. That's why the BAS is so critically important. If we have the boundary in the wrong place and a response is geocoded either from the census or from a sample survey such as the ACS, and that response is coded to a location on the ground that's actually outside of the jurisdiction based on what we know, then the tabulation is not going to be correct. So while it's important for us to tabulate, to count everyone and tabulate everyone, it's also very important to have the geography correct. And so those of us who practice GIS, it's really a geocoding effort. We geocode every housing unit to a location on the ground. If that geocode is incorrect because of a boundary problem or the geocode itself is inaccurate, then we can't tabulate correctly. So that's what geographers do at the Census Bureau. We worry about those issues. Do we have all the addresses? Do we have the boundaries in the right place? And we spend a lot of time figuring out that if that is true. As participants in our programs, whether it's the census addresses, whether it's the boundary and annexation survey, you're providing us information that tells us what's true. This is what's true for our jurisdiction. And when we ingest that information, we're able to say, this is fact, this is what we know, this is how we're going to geocode. So that's a very generalistic description of what we do with addresses and why the BAS is so important. The same can be said for census tracts. Even though they're statistical in nature, if you want good data, you need good geography, whether it's political geography or statistical geography. So I've got an example of how tracts split. I can discuss that now. Is that all right? So I'm going to share my screen again. And once again, I apologize for not being able to be in presentation mode, but I'm not going to try to figure out why it's more challenging than it should be for me on this. This is an example of a census tract covering an area in Denver, Colorado that was once known as Stapleton Airport. Those of you who have ever flown in it.
It's Jim's favorite area.
Yes, it is. What's interesting about this example, there's a very, very similar situation in Austin. Of course, all of you from Austin know that you have a new airport as well. So this is really the situation here in Denver. We had Stapleton International Airport all the way up until 1995, until Denver International Airport opened, now known as DEN, but we just can't shake calling it DIA. We still call it DIA. But this old airport, Stapleton International Airport, has been around for a very long time. And planners at the Denver Regional Council of Governments, the equivalent of CAPCOG, we call them Dr. COG here in Denver, kind of a cutesy name. Dr. COG has been involved in planning for census activities for a long time and in a close relationship with the Census Bureau and the governments, constituent governments in the Denver metro area. They've defined a unique tract for Stapleton Airport way back in 1947, I think, when it first opened for commercial service. They decided it needed to have its own census tract. It probably wasn't this tract number. But the point here is that for the 2000 census, the airport has its own census tract. And if I could take a moment to point some things out there, maybe you can see my mouse.
Yeah, we can.
Good, thank you. To the above right of that tract number, which is actually census tract 41.05, there's an implied decimal there. There's an area of, this is not residential, it's a bunch of warehouses. This is a commercial district. So there is some heavy machinery in this area. There are a warehouse district in here. And the key element for this area is that there are no residential units in this. This is all business and commercial. And it's was directly related to the airport. So,
and Jim, if you don't mind me jumping in, I think this is actually a
sure.
good place to just talk about census tracts in general. So census tracts are supposed to be groups of, or an area of land that have about 4,000 people in them. The reason it's 4,000 is because at that level, we're able to publish a whole lot of data from the American Community Survey. So that's the threshold. Once you get bigger than that, we'd rather publish it down to a smaller area. So we try to keep it around 4,000. In some cases, you'll see a census tract that has either no population or virtually no population. And that happens for a lot of different reasons across the country. Here, it's happening because there's nobody really living here, and so we won't be able to publish data for the census tract, but it keeps from diluting the data for, say, this neighborhood to the top right. So if you included all this land, the population density would be really off. So this started out as basically, I don't think this was technically a special land use tract, but a tract that was isolated because it wasn't really a population, it wasn't really an area where people lived or slept. So it was isolated for that reason. And then just like Muller or Mueller, I know I say it wrong, whichever one it is, I'm doing it wrong. But when population growth came in here, this was just a really good example of how we had to split over time to keep those pieces of land at 4,000 people per tract.
Thanks, Lacey. We're used to doing this discussion together, and it's great to play off each other when we have this dialogue, because, you know, as a geographer, I focus on the geography, and sometimes Lacey can focus on the data, but we often see the same issue from a different view, and that's what's great about working with a statistician. They get to see this geography from a different viewpoint. An interesting thing to note in this picture, those of us who are GISers, there's what looks like a little equal sign down here below this tract identifier, and you might want to just kind of keep your eye on it as we progress, because I'm going to start showing you this same area as we go through the next 3 censuses, and what happens to this area. Similar to Mueller, Bueller, anyone, I don't know. Similar situation to Austin with the redevelopment there. Same scenario. Why did this area change? Well, for Denver, Stapleton Airport had noise problems, congestion, houses built up all around, as you can see in this black and white image. This is an actual image from 1989, I believe it. No, I'm sorry. It was right before the 2000 census, so 1999 perhaps. The airport was closed at this point. It had closed in 95, but it had not been changed. The terminal is still here. The concourses are still here. There's a cut through the runways right here underneath this tract number. But there are 2 white objects here. Turns out these are highway overpasses that are being put in place for realignment of Interstate 70. So let's move forward 10 years and look at this same area. Thank goodness for satellite imagery, right? We're now looking at this area right around the 2010 census. The Stapleton Airport is long gone, Denver International Airport, which is far off to the upper right in this image. It is now open and functional. The area of what was Stapleton Airport has now started redevelopment, and not coincidentally, it is now called the Stapleton neighborhood. And that's specifically this area right here where my mouse is bouncing around. Some changes to that tract. Let's talk about that. One of the things that Lacey talked about is that the definitions of tracts is that they have about 4,000 people. We try to maintain that all across the country. So tracts are directly comparable, where I can't necessarily compare the city of Denver to the city of Dallas or Houston, because one city is much larger than the other. And we can't say that Denver has X number of Native Americans, whereas Dallas has X number, because we're looking at apples and oranges. The notion of a tract is that they're all about the same size. So we can say there are X number of people here, the X characteristics of folks there, and be able to compare them directly. So the idea is that tracts maintain as strict a geographic definition as possible as we progress through time. And the original design is that that outer tract boundary remain the same. In order for us to do a comparison, if we're a long-term planner, we want to be able to compare, how is this neighborhood changing through time? What are the differences in this area? And we do that. That's the whole notion behind census tracts. We do that by defining a boundary and assigning a number. That number ideally shouldn't change unless the tract itself has to change. If the tract is different and we don't change the number, then we're not comparing the same tract. So that the program itself requires that if a tract changes by more than 15% in area or population, the number has to be changed. That is the primary reason why this tract has been split into 3 pieces, and I'm going to explain them in just a second. You can see the original tract number here is in the parent number. So here's the original piece of a census tract. It's again, there's no decimal in the image, but we know it is we know it is tract 41.05 in the 2000 census. And if I come down here in the 2010, that number has been retired for the 2010 census. It's still there for the 2000 census, but now we have two new tracts, 41.07 and 41.06. Those, we call them extensions, and they indicate to us as users that the original tract 41.05 has been split because we can't see it in this decade's tract plan. And you're looking at that and you're going, hey, yeah, Jim, great, but what about that number over there with that commercial area? What's that 980100 thing? That is a special land use tract number. All of our special land use tracts start with the 9000, actually the 9800 series. And this is defined to tell the user that this tract should not have much, if any, population in it at all. And so that if you look at this tract in the data, it may show up as 0 for the decennial data, or data not available for ACS because the sample was too small. In this case, there shouldn't have been any sample at all because it's a special land use tract. And in this definition, it's okay to be 0. And as Lacey mentioned before, the idea with a special land use tract is that it not dilute a neighboring area that might have been included in it, so that just to the east of 980100 is a very large suburban tract of homes. And if this commercial area were to have been included in that census tract to the east, all kinds of density information would be skewed because of the unpopulated area of that commercial.
I mean, you were on a roll, man, so I hate to jump in here at all. Like, I feel like if you had a podium and a flag, it'd be way better in person. But do you mind if I jump in here with a couple things? So
please.
So to start off with this original outer shell that didn't have a population, when they came, and you said it was Dr. CAPCOG that actually did this one, Jim, is that right? Because we work with councils of governments across the country.
Correct. Yes.
So we were estimating, I'm assuming this census tract did have a population of around 8,000 people. And so they needed to break it into at least two places that had 4,000 people. So that's your 004107 and then your 004106. And then they isolated 98,100 so that it didn't mess with the population or the characteristics of the other ones.
Right.
So the number comes from literally dividing it by 4,000 or getting as close as we possibly can. This is how it changed decade to decade, and I think you've got a couple more going forward. This happens a lot of, all over the country where I am. I'm in Leander. I was in one of those crazy numbers that you mentioned earlier, Andrew. It can be cow pasture that turns into housing units. It can be a downtown area that is redeveloped and becomes apartments where it used to be parking lots. Population growth can happen for a lot of different reasons, and the vast majority of times that census tracts change decade to decade, it's because of population growth. So if you get above that 8,000 threshold, there are some places, and I know we mentioned rural earlier, population decline even in rural areas in central Texas. There are some areas where if your census tract falls below a certain threshold, you can look at combining it with another one. That's pretty rare in this area, so I don't think we need to go into it too much. But the vast majority of times the census tract change, it's because of population growth, so you're splitting them. There are also some unique situations if you're along a waterway and the waterway boundary changes, or mountains. We don't have any of those here, but especially for this region, the reason that you're splitting census tracts the vast majority of the time is population growth.
Thank you. That's right. Saying it much more succinctly, as we move forward to 2020, this is the plan for the latest census. So we've split them yet again, as Lacey just mentioned. We split them because the population increased. And if you look in these areas, what was once airport runways are now neighborhoods with streets and houses, and it's suburban in nature. So the design is to create census tracts with about 4,000 people. That's the goal. It's not always possible. It's assuming that you have good information to start with and an active planning community who is interested in accurate information. We know that CAPCOG and Dr. COG are both very active in this regard, and so there are always good plans that come out of it. The tract numbers are split accordingly so that the original parent number of 41 is still there. And it tells us that if we were to take all of those tracts that were originally 41 something and combine them back together, that we could aggregate together all of the pieces into an original tract 41 and be able to compare from decade to decade how things have changed. So that's kind of perhaps a little bit of a drawn out description of how and why tracts change. And again, there's a very similar situation in the core city of Austin with your airport there having the same situation. So
Yeah,
comments or questions on that?
Well, I was going to jump in for a couple more things. I mean, this can also happen where there was no residential housing before, there wasn't anybody living or sleeping there. That happens. But in theory, also, when these chunks of land are being split up into.
Lacey, you're on mute again.
Did we lose her?
Can you guys hear me now?
There you are.
Oh man, I was on a roll. Okay. So one of the things too that we'll talk about, and this happened over the past decade and has happened in decades past, when you go to split census tracts, within the outer census tract, you're going to try to isolate communities that are very similar. So sometimes this can be a housing unit or a development that is unique. So like, a lot of neighborhoods have their own name. It can be a prison. It can be a university, it can be a dormitory, anything like that. Anything that has a really specific and unique type of population, you want to isolate those as much as you can so that you can see how those populations change over time, but also so they're not skewing the data for surrounding areas. If you have a men's dormitory where everyone's between the ages of 18 and 22, right next to a residential neighborhood, that data is going to skew it a lot. So you want to keep those separate as much as you possibly can in some of these situations. Any other questions about the tracts? I mean, the tracts are really the fundamental statistical. It's a little. I like them the most. They're the ones we use the most. But any questions there? And Andrew, I see yours. I'm going to come right back to that.
They are a lot of fun because you really do, as communities in the Capital Area Council, you do have input into this design, and we will be working with CAPCOG again here in just about 5 years or so to talk about what the 2030 tracks should be like.
Just if you're when a data you think user, you're rid of us.
Yeah. I mean, if you're a data user and you say, well, these tracks are great, but man, this one doesn't work so well because this is exactly what this program is about. Talk to us about it. And when I say us, CAPCOG is our huge, big partner in this process. And they're our partner because it's a regional planning effort. We want the plan to make sense regionally speaking, whether it's for transportation, programs for the aged, whether it's for underprivileged, whatever the program might be. The tracks are there to serve the community, and you have an opportunity to make changes, to make suggestions, to make those tracks best fit your needs in that community. And so Andrew, I'm going to stop sharing my screen on this one.
Well, Andrew, you've got a really good question in the chat too. So Andrew was asking about, I'm not sure exactly what area he was talking about, but he said, was there a reason that a central tract was included? Basically, and he was asking if, it says, what was the reason the central tract included all of the northern runway area rather than it being grouped with the warehouse? Was it planned for future residential development? So I wasn't involved in this process specifically for this area, but in theory, that should not. So it's kind of a fine line. So there are a lot of places where there's these big plans, and sometimes they work out, sometimes they don't. What I will say is we try to keep the census tracts that are made within the required criteria. So you can't have a census tract out in the middle of nowhere where there's absolutely nothing left or nothing yet. And you're expecting massive housing boom, which happens. Sometimes it's happened here. But there does have to be a population of 4,000. Well, there's a few exceptions, but we try to keep it above the threshold, the population threshold, so we can publish for it.
Jim, if you could advance it to the next slide. So the question here was, it looks like the population we're talking about is concentrated maybe down on the southern part, kind of below where the number is, right? And a lot of the northern part of this tract is just remnants of what the airport was.
Right.
And so the question would be, if you can get the 4,000 population just with that sort of southern area, what's the logic in grouping then the whole rest of this area that includes all of the rest of this runway, which is not where there's nobody, right? And which is which would, as you were sort of talking about before, kind of skew what the representation of density, residential density for the southern part of this area will look like. So
Jim,
I'm just.
Well, say Jim was probably involved with this one personally, right? Jim, do you know? I mean, it's kind of hard to speak on other people's work too because it's a different cog. But if you know exactly why they kept it that way.
Well, sure.
And what I'm getting at is just when you're doing this, how much of it is looking at things as they are versus things as you expect them to be over the next 10 years.
Right. And actually, Lacey touched on it when she was talking about the best laid plans don't always work out. And that's probably, if I recall, this situation, because when these plans are defined, ideally they're done in a time frame that allows us a chance to review them. And in this case, I do recall a pretty involved dialogue with the planning agency, Denver Regional Council, about the inclusion. Because Andrew, you're right. Normally you would look at this and you think, that tract has got a lot of different land use all combined into one. It doesn't seem like it would create a good geographic boundary for a statistical entity. And you're right, it doesn't really make sense. But the issue here was the long-term planned land use for this. What was planned was a development north, at the very north end, that was going to be another residential area. They didn't know at that time when that development might come into play, yet they didn't want to limit themselves in the future censuses by completely changing the boundaries. So they had a couple of things that were defining their movements. It's kind of a little bit like a chess game here in that we really didn't want them to change the original exterior boundary, right? And they could have split off that northern piece that's north of I-70 right here. But then if they did that, the only way we'd allow them to do that is if they created another special land use tract like this one, because this would not have nearly enough population to be a tract to stand on its own. So we wouldn't let them create that unless they create a special land use tract. If they did that, that kind of commits this area to being a special land use from now on. We don't want a special land use tract to be here today, gone tomorrow. It should be something that's going to be that way for a long time. So the thought was, at some point, this area north of the highway is going to be residential. We can't make it a special land use tract. The census won't let us. It won't fit the criteria. And we don't want to limit our flexibility in the future. So we're just going to have to kind of suck it up and have this fairly long tract with a lot of undeveloped land mixed into this developed area to the south. And so, yes, the answer there is they were planning long term. And while the development was in flux, they had to deal with some of the planned development, the actual development, and where they wanted the plan to end up in the long term. And so that's what they were dealing with in this situation. Other questions? Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen again.
So Jim, I think this is actually a natural progression too. So the purpose of the census tract program and the census tracts and participant statistical areas program, the splitting of tracts over decades, is to make sure that you have comparability over time to a piece of land. So you have to go back and combine them, but you can see how things have changed on a piece of land. Andrew, I'm going to circle back to your question about places. So the city of Austin's boundaries change. And if you're trying to compare the city of Austin to how it was, I don't actually know specifically how it was, but say 50 or 100 years ago, I would assume that the boundaries are fairly different. It is very hard to compare. That is very much comparing apples to oranges. So when we release the new ACS, and we were talking about that earlier, the 5-year ACS will be based on the current geographies. So the geographies as they are and actually in Tiger, which I think most of you guys use and most of you are familiar with, there are different vintages. So you can go back and look at what the vintage is, but it's going to be that reference year number. So the 2020 American Community Survey data that we just released is for the 2020 boundaries. So it is very, and that is one of the most frustrating things statistically about comparing legal entities, and zip codes are worse. I mean, so there's a lot of places where it's very hard to compare because you're literally not comparing the same geography, right? It's the city, but it's not the same piece of land. And so that's why having census tracts very specifically help you do those comparisons over time for a piece of land where the political boundaries or zip codes and school districts are another great example. They can change dramatically at sometimes. And so it's very hard to, when you're comparing those two, you're not comparing the same piece of land.
Right.
And Jim, do you want to touch on census designated places? Because I'm getting nowhere near this about whether or not there's going to be another opportunity to update them intercensally. I am staying so far away from that.
Sure. We believe at this point that there will be an opportunity to make changes to CDPs through intercensal years. I say we believe because there's nothing official yet. The plan or the idea, I don't even know if I can call it a plan yet. I think the notion at Census is that why not make CDP definition just like BAS? CDPs are statistical. There is nothing about them that has a requirement in legal definitions anywhere. So if Census decided we wanted to make CDPs that were pink because that's the rule we wanted, then we could do it. What we're thinking is, why not allow CDP definitions every year to go along with the BAS? Since we're creating these and updating these legal jurisdictions, why not do the same for these statistical entities? So we're kind of stuck right now in that why not kind of thing, kind of asking the questions internally, why not? And we don't have an answer to the why not yet. I think most of us are saying, well, there is no good reason. But I'm confident that in the very near future, we will all have the opportunity to submit CDP suggestions that can occur every year. It just is not official yet. So what other issues do we have?
Oh, that's a loaded question.
Jim, could you talk a little bit more about what factors go into, defining CDPs? What are the things the Census Bureau staff is looking at when they decide, yeah, that's a place, or no, that's not a place, or this place includes, these addresses, but not those addresses?
Sure. And I should point out, Dorothy dealt a lot with this. And while I tend to be pretty vocal, Dorothy is very capable of talking about all of this as well. The whole notion of a census designated place is that the entity itself has a sense of place. In fact, when we first started thinking about implementing CDPs for 1950, we said, we recognize the fact that there are all these incorporated places out there, but that there should be an opportunity for unincorporated places to be represented as well. And the fundamental criteria that has been consistent across all decades is that it have a local sense of place. In other words, people know of that area as a place. And Lacey, what's the one outside Houston that we like to use?
The Woodlands.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, and it's an important distinction too. So I mean, we produce data for political geographies or cities or places because it's important for people living in those cities and places to understand their area. And the Woodlands is a great example of it is so similar. No, it doesn't have a highest elected official, but you still want to know what's going on there, and it's important for planning and understanding population change.
What has changed about CDPs over the decades is the minimum housing unit criteria. We originally had, I want to say 100 or something like that with one of the original CDP definitions. And, through feedback every decennial, other folks have said, why 100? What if there are only 50 people living there? So the latest definition, Dorothy, you can correct me, I think it's 10 housing units, Dorothy, does that sound right? So we look at is the place known by a local name? is there a core area? This is another critical piece of this. So we want a CDP to be known not just by a name, but does it have a core area of development that people can sense or they know locally as the core for this place? Does it have a core area? Is it locally known by a common name? And then does it have the minimum housing unit criteria? A couple other minor details are, can it be drawn efficiently? Can we draw it in such a way that it's not grossly overbounded? Can we draw it? Because the big difference, glad we're talking, the big difference between places and CDPs, we have to draw CDPs using census block boundaries. We cannot split blocks when we draw CDPs. So we start with the blocks and aggregate them together, drawing around the block boundaries. A place does not have to play by those rules, because we know anytime an incorporation occurs, it's usually an annexation of a parcel or multiple parcels. They don't always follow census blocks, whereas a CDP definition is always built from existing decennial census blocks. So those are some basic criteria for the creation of CDPs.
And the main goal here with this geography and any other geography we use or produce or create is we're trying to produce data that is useful. So it's not that we just enjoy producing more data for more places. It's that you want, if you've got a place on the ground and you want to understand who lives there, we want to be able to provide that for you. So census designated places filled a gap that we didn't have filled until they existed. There's some other ones though that, Andrew, if you're looking for, like, because we get a lot of questions on these. So like a census designated place would never be just a huge, massive rural area, right? There's no sense of place, it can be huge. Those can be census county divisions. There are other geographies that some of those places can fit within, but a census designated place really like has the feel of a place. I mean, Jim and I have literally gotten into arguments with people in census designated places about whether or not they were actually places. And remember, one guy was positive he lived next door to the mayor of a place that didn't exist. But it really does have like a fundamental feeling. A lot of them have postal names, like the Woodlands, that you can address a letter to, things like that. So that's the main difference. Where census county division can be a more liberal, larger piece of land without a sense of place. It's kind of the dichotomy there.
Dorothy, any additions about CDPs?
I guess I would just add about the rural ones, because I know in Central Texas, we have a lot of those. We have both big and small ones. So like, for instance, my mother lives in a CDP called Utopia, which has about 225 people in its boundaries. And the thing is, there are a lot of people who say they're in Utopia and they are not actually in the boundaries of Utopia. The thing with rural CDPs is that we are really trying to capture with those the centrally located dense population of that CDP. There are a lot of people who live way out on county roads and stuff who may still identify with that place, but we can't reasonably capture all of those people within the boundaries of a CDP. So I think that's something to keep in mind, is that CDPs are trying to fill a gap, but they're not really exactly the same as places. Like with a place, you can have weird little jets and stuff that zoom off into nowhere. With a CDP, it really does need to be compact. And so that means necessarily you might kind of cut out some of those people who are not so close to that densely populated center. But that doesn't, in the case of a CDP the size of 225 people, it's not really, it's not a huge difference to the data that we capture. So we're still capturing the essence of Utopia in that sense. So.
And that's a really good point, Dorothy. You know, if you get this larger area, you really do want to be, you know, the reason we don't just publish data at the national level is you want to understand what's lower, and the smaller and the more compact you get, the more that data is relevant to the people that live there. I'm totally with you. There are a lot of people that, you know, identify as that might be the closest town, the closest place, but that doesn't necessarily match the geographic boundaries. And Jim, I think, or Dorothy, if you guys want to tackle this one too, I think one of the questions is kind of like, okay, so there's no mayor, even if somebody thinks they're the mayor. Who do you go to? How do these things come up? Like, who comes to you with a, and I know, Dorothy, you've dealt with this a lot, so if you want to jump in, like, how does the process work? So like, who comes to you from utopia and says, hey, I think we should have a census designated place? How does that process work since it's not an incorporated area?
So it can happen a lot of different ways. I think the most common way that it happens is people find out about PSAP, and because PSAP kind of reaches into all the corners of people who deal with census. I mean, it's not just governments who participate in PSAP. Large organizations, universities, hospitals, nonprofits all get really involved. And so, like for instance, a situation that we had last census in 2020 was that somebody who just happened to, she worked at like a university library, and she just happened to walk in on a PSAP meeting, and she was like, hey, there's this place I know about, and I'm pretty sure it's a CDP. How do I go about adding that? And, you know, so really anybody can be like, I think this place is a CDP, but it still has to go through the proper channels. So like if that happens, I would have told her, hey, here's your PSAP participant. Here's their contact information. You can reach out to them and talk to them about adding that to their submission. And, you know, if we start to have other avenues for submitting CDPs, then it would be the same sort of thing. Like if someone called, I would say, hey, here's your BAS contact or whatever. and you can call them and we can
go from there.
Yeah.
So yeah, so basically somebody either comes to you or goes directly to the Council of Governments, and then it's submitted through the Council of Governments. Okay, good deal. Because yeah, this is kind of one of those things like, okay, so who's in charge of deciding that that has a place and feel? So, okay. What other questions? Because Jim, I think you're finished with the PowerPoint, right? I mean, we can talk and fill up this time. I've seen us do it, but
there was a question about ZICTAs.
Oh,
I'm going to share my screen for a second. Go ahead. So, but it's got some information.
Yeah, Dorothy, go for it.
So we had a question from Pamela. Could you explain further how Census Bureau zip code boundaries are different from USPS zip code boundaries? And I gave her kind of a very simple, quick answer, which is that I'll repeat out loud. Essentially, we look at every block and we look at what zip code is assigned to every address in a block. So let's say we find out that 80% of the addresses in a given census block have the same zip code. If that happens, we assign that entire block the same ZICTA. So even though not all the addresses in that block have the same zip code, we give them all the same ZICTA. And we just kind of continue that process. So we do it at the block level. And then once we have ZICTAs assigned to each block, we aggregate those into a single geography. And then there is some smoothing that happens. So zip codes are kind of weird because they're not actually a geography in the sense that like we think about it. They're not like a polygon. They're not a boundary. Zip codes, as they're used by the USPS, are a routing methodology. And so we can't really one-to-one change those into a boundary. And so that's why we have ZICTAs. ZICTAs are essentially our closest approximation that we can give you of a zip code. And so they're not perfectly accurate, but I would say they are, basically 90% of the time, 90+% of the time, they are accurate. So they're approximations of zip code routes. Hopefully that answers that question. But I'd be happy to go into more detail if anyone wants to know any more of the weeds of that.
Dorothy, I'm going to add one more thing to that. So the zip code ZICTAs are created every decennial or right for the releases, and they are the same for 10 years. So the good news and bad news about, right? Okay, you both just gave me a look and I was like, wait, have I been wrong for this whole time? So the good news and bad news is it's easier to compare data over time. So for 10 years, the downside is that the post office can change their zip codes at any given time. And so it is possible. So they'll start out super, super, super close to the original zip code boundaries. The ZICTAs will start out very close. And in the vast majority of places, and especially more densely populated places that are more stable, they don't change all that much. There are some areas, though, where the post office makes some really dramatic changes, and therefore they might differ further along in the decade. I saw a question here about the ACS in more rural areas, and I know that that's a constant frustration. This says in working with rural communities, we often find the ACS have larger margins of error, and so basically the data is not as good. However, federally funded programs are also allocated based on ACS population results. As a funding agency tasked with the regional distributions of funds across rural areas of the state, we often monitor MOE's margins of error and its potential impact on funding ability to rural communities. Is this more appropriate? Is there a more appropriate census product to utilize population estimates in rural geographies? At the risk of just really making this, if there's not another estimate available, that's your best estimate. And the more rural you get and the more the less dense a population is, the larger the margins of error will be. So when you're looking at the smaller the population, the larger margin of error going to be for sometimes counties are a good example of that. Once you're looking at, if you're trying to get to if you're trying to get to a literally physically small piece of ground where there's very few people, it's going to be harder to do that. But down to the tracts and even the census block groups, the margins of error, we won't publish them if we don't feel the data is statistically relevant. So usually there's not another option A, but then B, this, especially if we have 5-year data combined, we don't publish anything for geography that we don't feel is statistically significant or useful. Okay, if we missed any others here, I just realized I had started talking and missed some of the scrolling.
I don't think we have any that weren't answered. I just scrolled through, but we did just get a new one.
Yes, we did. I know. Yay. People are engaging. It's exciting.
Go for it, Lacey.
Yeah,
I was
whoever.
Throw that one at Dorothy.
It's CDPs.
Okay,
Yeah,
Dorothy.
Maybe I missed this discussed earlier, but what is the economic or political advantage of being declared a CDP?
That actually is a statistical question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So there are some. So there's one of the biggest things is, and it's very frustrating, is if you live in an area and don't have data for it because it doesn't qualify as something else, you just don't know how to pitch something, understand something, plan around something. So as soon as you're a CDP, and this happens sometimes in places that are looking to incorporate or just places that are looking to understand their population more. If you have a CDP, the biggest advantage is we will be producing data for it. So if we're producing data for it, then if you want to try to get, I'm very excited, there's a Wendy's opening down the street soon. So if you're trying to get a Wendy's, like we're trying to get a Trader Joe's to show up in Leander or Cedar Park, if you are a CDP, you'll have the data to back that up. You can tell about the characteristics in your area, where before you would have had that kind of data desert. So that is I would say that's the most important part about it. So I don't think there's a really specifically direct economic or political advantage, but you will have more information and therefore more power to make decisions and lobby for whatever your community may need. And that includes, social, housing, education, all sorts of information from the American Community Survey, because we'll at least attempt to publish it for census designated places as well.
Oh, I have to tell my Wyoming CDP story.
All right, everybody, buckle up. I'm starting a timer.
So in Wyoming, CDPs are used to, in addition to places, are used to distribute highway funds. We at Census did not know that. And for the 2010 census, there was a certain CDP in Wyoming that we felt no longer met the criteria, so we deleted it. And boy, there were some unhappy folks because the state no longer provided highway funds. Way to make it sound like we know what we're doing,
Jim. That's great. Way to make it sound like we're really on top of things.
And then there was one other CDP in Wyoming that had one person totally, and it didn't meet the criteria for CDP, so we deleted it. And the guy was very upset because he was very well known as the guy who lived in the place in Wyoming that had one person. Anyway.
Was it named after him? Was it like Bob's place?
It was Buford.
Was it
Buford, Wyoming. It was somebody's name. It wasn't his name. It was the person who originally lived there. But anyway, it's true story, a little funny, and also a little unfortunate, but I don't think anyone seriously was affected by that.
There we go. Okay, so we just got another question. Will there be any Will any of you be showing additional information on the CQR operation? I'm going to send that one over to you guys.
Dorothy, go for it.
Well, I guess we can answer questions if anyone has questions about CQR. It's started already, so we can certainly answer any questions that might be out there while we're here. Other than that, I'm not sure what all there is to necessarily cover with CQR, other than what we've already kind of briefly went over.
I can throw out a couple things. So, like for someone who came from the outside of it, I didn't really understand how the process worked. So, all three of us talk. A lot of people are like, "That's not the right number. That's not the number of people that live here." You can't just say it's not the number of people I see at the grocery store. What you'll have to do is make a direct challenge. And I know you touched on it earlier. So what you'll have to do is say, okay, in this census block, can you guys just give an overview? Like, say, is it there? Basically, like if a housing unit was misplaced. Or can you just walk through like what the actual challenge, like what you're actually challenging?
Okay, yeah, I can definitely talk about that. So essentially, there's two types of challenges you can submit for the 2020 CQR. You can challenge the group quarters population counts, but only within group quarters. You cannot challenge population counts elsewhere. For other geographies, you can challenge the housing count. And what that looks like is essentially we give you a block list that says this is how many houses we counted in this block, and you send it back to us and say this is how many we counted. And then along with that, you'll send us some supporting documentation, and that can be so many things. I'm not even going to start to get into that, but if you're having trouble with that or you have questions about that, certainly give us a call, because it's so situational. It varies so much from place to place what your supporting documentation can look like. But yeah, that's really, it's basically just that simple. It's a list of blocks with our count, your count, and then your evidence that supports that count that you're providing us. So, and then we just, from there, we research.
Awesome.
So I guess, Dorothy, my question specifically is, we've heard, you very specifically said you could only challenge population and for group quarters, but not for other geographies. But in challenging a housing unit count, you essentially are challenging population, right? Will that population be reflected if additional housing units, I understand not in 2020 census products, but in other ways, you can get a different population number if your challenge to the housing unit count is upheld. Is that right?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on this. Again, there's a lot of different situations and how housing counts can be off, I guess. Like there's different things that can cause them to be off. So for instance, if we had a situation where we geocoded the house wrong, and so we geocoded it on the wrong side of the street, and that puts it in a totally different city or something. It won't change the decennial data, but future data sets will reflect both that housing, I would assume, because the housing has been re-geocoded to the correct place, it's going to be retabulated. The population associated with that housing unit is also going to be retabulated. So yes, in a sense, in a kind of like indirect sense, you are still correcting population.
And then I've heard a couple of rumors about how the CQR will not cover potential address omissions. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like if for some reason under new construction survey or the LUCA addressing portion of it, some addresses still didn't get captured, are those considered omissions? Or yeah, I'm just a little bit confused because it seems like some of this changed in this process from last time.
So I'll be honest, I'm not sure that I know what exactly precisely is meant by an omission, an address omission. And so I don't want to answer that question because I wouldn't want to give you the wrong info. But I mean, in general, so anything, here's what I can generally say. Whatever addresses were in universe for the 2020 census should be up for challenge. I don't know if necessarily some of the addresses you're talking about maybe weren't included in the 2020 enumeration universe. So if that's the case, then yeah, it's possible those are not up for debate, I suppose. But in general, if we actually, went out and enumerated it, then yeah, it should be eligible for CQR.
And that probably is what you mean, Lila, right? That like, if it was not in the universe or was not in the map or for whatever reason for the 2020 census, is there a way to get it added? Is that what you're basically asking?
Right.
Yeah. So, and I think one of the things that this is, you're right, it's a weird fine line. Like you can challenge housing units, but not population. Basically what we're not able to do is go back and re-enumerate. So that's why it's more focused on housing units. Well, it's completely focused on housing units, not more, except for group quarters. So I think at least the thought process is, Luca and new construction filled in those gaps of making sure that we had, and that was a relationship we had with local government. So that was the opportunity to make sure that our address list was completely correct when we went into the field. So that's what that process was. And then it's just if we screwed up where we put them at this point. So we went through the whole, this is your last shot, like this is our list, is everything there? And then if it wasn't, what we're looking at now is making sure we don't have them in the right, we have them in the right place. And sometimes it sounds silly, but Dorothy's example of like being on the other side of the road, sometimes that's one house, sometimes it's a huge apartment complex, right? So it can be a big deal, but yeah, I haven't heard, Lila hears rumors more quickly than we do. We need to talk about it more often, but yeah, I think that's what it was. Because Jim, in theory, right, you're moving a unit, or Dorothy, you're moving a unit, right? You're not completely adding something to the universe through this process. Okay.
And so then what is the point of giving you what we have for a block that may be different from what you have? If it's just based on placement, like it just seems, yeah, it seems like potentially a lot of work that's just going to be frustrating because we're going to find out that maybe we had a lot of housing units that are under omission category, but not misplacement, but there's nothing to do about that.
That's kind of the point, actually. You would find out. I mean, if in your situation, if you felt there was a block where census missed a whole bunch of housing units and you submit them to us, we're going to tell you that if we missed them or not. While there isn't anything you can do about it for the decennial count, we will correct the counts for the future. So all of the population estimates and all of the samples for ACS will be adjusted to reflect that new information. That said, they have to be housing units that are in the census. If we're talking about addresses that were not even in the universe, as Dorothy mentioned, because for some reason we were unable to collect them, and that can't happen.
Or they weren't there yet.
Or they weren't there.
We've had that conversation too.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Those will not get added. We can't collect that through the CQR process. We'll collect it through other means, through other programs and processes, but not through CQR.
And Lila, along those lines, well, say along those lines too, and it's easy for me to say because I don't have to do any of it. But the really hard work falls on the Denver Regional Office Geography team. So you'll send, this is our number, this is their number, and I know I'm biased, but you really couldn't have a better team in the country to go back, and they will painstakingly go through it and see if any of that happens. So, if you've got a housing count for blocks and they just don't line up, that would be.
We'll be researching address by address.
For months and years.
So yeah, rest assured that when you send that to us, we will be looking at it very carefully.
Every single one. I look forward to
important.
hearing about it.
That's an important distinction, Dorothy, that while you will only send us counts for CQR, we actually have to look at every address in that block. Mm-hmm. So we're going to, let's say we said 10 and you say there are 15. We'll go and look at that number and we'll say, oh, here are the 10. We've got 10 addresses. We know they're there, and here are corresponding housing units. Lila says they're 15. we'll go looking for those 15 and try to find out where they are. Did we miss them? Are they in a wrong block? And we'll look for every situation. Now, if you do a boundary challenge, then you're submitting addresses to us. If you're doing a block challenge only, you're only submitting total counts to us. So if it's a
Well,
boundary
lists of
challenge,
documents, right? So that you know how to best
Right.
research it. Yeah. So in theory, like if you send the addresses, that'd be.
right. If you're suggesting it's because the boundary was wrong, we're going to ask you to submit a list of addresses affected by that boundary.
Okay, thank you. And can we send you the opposite? Can we tell you, you found more, we found less, and you tell us, because I think one of the things we found was that in some of the places where we found more, but we saw fewer in the census count, it was a block that was adjacent to a block where you found more and we found less. And so there is some sort of placement issue, I think, or geocoding issue.
Yes.
But it would be helpful to be able to let you know a positive or negative discrepancy, because it does relate to the accuracy of the placement of the address.
Still
Yeah.
correction. So
Okay.
Still
Cool.
correction.
definitely look at
Okay.
that.
And bear in
Thank you.
mind, if there are two places with coincident boundaries, somebody's going to lose when somebody wins.
Yes. So thank you. This makes me feel a lot better about this process, because I was seeing a lot of, rumors, and it was seeming like it was going to be a lot of work internally for the people requesting the review, with perhaps very little returns. But I know that you guys are very thorough in your work, and I really appreciate it. This makes me feel a lot better.
Thanks, Layla. Andrew, what are you thinking over there?
Well, so I have a question. I mean, one of the things I'm taking away from this whole conversation is that this master address list that y'all have is a super important product that is getting updated. It feeds into all these different products, and so I guess I have a little bit of a question. A narrow one and a broader one, not only for census staff, but for some of the other participants on this call. We've got people who assign 911 addresses, right, who are updating these address lists every month. We also have planners who need to make decisions that have bearing on how, what gets approved on different places and whatnot. So, we have I think just in the last 10 years, of this big trend of tiny houses going on, existing lots, right? And so they're separate structures. I don't know whether or not these are or are not getting assigned separate addresses. And I don't know if there's, I don't know within this area, for instance, if I know that there's permitting that goes on with it, but I don't know whether or not is the owner of the property filling out the census form for, on behalf of what's essentially their tenant in some respect, and is that different than what would be the case if you have, say, a duplex and, the owner of that house is getting something and the other resident downstairs or something is getting something else. So it's a bit of a, just how do you handle situations like that where the, it's not as clear cut as one person kind of renting a unit or owning their own housing unit.
These are the questions that keep Dorothy and I very busy. I tend to be a little blunt with my answers sometimes, maybe a little bit too blunt, and I don't mean to sound that way. One of the biggest challenges we have at Census is maintaining an accurate map. It's a huge challenge. I had a phone call from a state representative about a month ago, and she was asking about CQR, and she was talking, we talked quite a long time on the phone, and the basic question was, how do you guys do this? I mean, how do you do a census? And we talked about the math and why the math is, we think it's pretty good. And once she understood what the math was, she basically said, how do you do that? I mean, I do the same thing. I do it for the state, but it's impossible. Everybody's got different address formats. Everybody has different reporting procedures. You guys are at the national level. How can you possibly keep an accurate address list? And what I told her, I said, it's a challenge. It really is. And it's one of our biggest challenges in geography is maintaining an accurate master address file. But briefly, there are a number of things that we do to try to do a good job with it. The number one thing that we do every year is we take two submissions from the United States Postal Service in the form of a delivery sequence file. Now, if you don't know what the DSF is, delivery sequence file, this is a product that the post office creates to keep track of every deliverable address in the country. If you recall back in those days when you rented an apartment, and one of the first things you did, you set up your stereo. That's what I did anyway. And the second thing you wanted to do was make sure that you got mail, right? I want to get my bills, I want to get stuff. And so it's important that people have a functional mailable address, and the Postal Service knows that. I mean, that's their bread and butter. We entered into an agreement with the Postal Service over 20 years ago. It's actually a requirement. The Redistricting Data Act requires that the post office provides to us twice a year their delivery sequence file for the entire country. We geocode that entire list to the master address file, and we attempt to find a location on the ground to the census block for every address. Any address that does not match comes into our workload, an annual workload of trying to fix it. And we have many different processes that address that fallout. So that's just one source of information from an external organization that has a very good list of addresses. Another source of addresses is the local update of census addresses, the program that's pre-census. We also have what was called the, well, I'm going to forget the name of it. Now we call it the, oh, Dorothy, what was the name of that update program? We have a new name for it now. We had to change the name because a new census came along.
It used to be GSS, the GSS program, and now it's SAID. And I honestly do not remember what that stands for, but it's SAID.
Streets, addresses, something data.
Imagery.
Imagery, it is imagery. Nice call from our statistician. Thanks, Lacey. Anyway, we have a budget every year through SAID that allows us to collect data from local governments. And we spent a lot of time over the last 2 decades working directly with cities and counties to collect their GIS data. I could give you a long, horrible history about the pros and the cons of that process. It's incredibly detailed and intensive. It requires all kinds of metadata, dialogue back and forth, but we ingest, the nutshell here is, or I'm sorry, the summary of all of that, so we ingest that data. We bring in those addresses. We bring in the road center lines when they're better. We're even starting to bring in parcel boundaries. In states like Montana, for example, we have an entire parcel layer in Tiger that came from the state's parcel efforts. And our goal eventually is to have parcels for the entire country. Why? Because most annexations occur by parcel. Most parcels or many parcels have an address, either for the owner or for the situs. So it's a very complicated process. The geography of working with the MAF and maintaining the MAF is a very complicated process, and we have multifaceted programs to address that issue. Is it perfect? No. Do we strive for perfection? Yes. And we get close in some places.
I would like to make it more complicated. So I think one of the things that we talk about a lot, and this doesn't apply to all of the surveys we do, but the MAF doesn't just contain places that, so it's supposed to be places that people live or sleep, and not every single place is necessarily mailable. So we still need to be able to geocode that. So there's a lot of places that people live and sleep that we need to go count, specifically during the decennial census. We don't have the resources to do that for every survey that we have. So the master address file, while certainly it has a housing unit that has a mailing address, we also have a lot of places that don't. There are a lot of people that live on boats. There are people that live in swamps. There are people that live in yurts. Yurts were very in this last decade. And so just because there's not a mailing address doesn't mean we're not required to go find that household. The more rural you get, the more examples are rural Alaska. I know is a whole different animal. But So the map has all these different data points, and some places we can mail to, some we can't. If we don't have a good mailing address, it does take you out of scope for many of our surveys, just because they're mail in many cases requirement. But for at least the decennial census, we'll use any place we know people live or sleep. All of that to say, Andrew, if there is a chance that somebody is going to be living and sleeping there, we want to know about it. It's our job to do the work to go find out that that's not the case. So if you have I can't speak to this specific example, but sometimes that might be considered a hotel type of thing where it's not somewhere we would enumerate as a normal residence, but sometimes it is. It might be, depending on the situation, it might be seasonal. So we'd much rather have the location and have whatever information you can give us, and then our job is to go out and verify it. And Jim and Dorothy are right. We have a lot of different programs annually, and then certainly a lot leading up to the 2030 census now to verify any addresses that we haven't been able to do so. But we'd much rather have that information and then go out and figure out whether or not it should be in our residential address file.
I would just ask anyone who's on the call from the region if y'all have any, anything to say about kind of this issue of assigning addresses and whatnot, and how you handle these situations like these detached structures and tiny homes and whatnot. Or not.
I do just want to add on to that, when we talk about LUCA and why it's so important that we have participation in those programs, it's because, yeah, we do get USPS addresses, and yeah, we do a lot of our own canvassing, but accessory units are one of those things where that really is hard for us to know about until we're actually out in the field and we figure out that there's an accessory unit. So, that's something where, yeah, when local governments know about, accessory units or tiny homes or mother-in-law units or whatever wide variety of these things there are, that's the kind of information that really helps us get a good count if you know about it. So.
I don't have a comment on the accessory dwelling units. I think it's a challenge even for our municipality to keep track of them, in all honesty. But we are working to, trying to find some ideas to improve those processes. But my question is, so are you guys expecting a lot of challenges through the CQR, given that it was such a challenged census? And do you feel prepared? It sounds like a whole lot of work that will have to take place. I hear that the Census Bureau is committed to responding within 90 days to each review request. Is that I don't know, are you guys feeling like, yeah, we can do this?
Dorothy's waiting for me. I'm waiting for Dorothy.
I know they can do it.
I mean, yeah, I think we are definitely, we're going to take it on. I mean, we don't really, we have to take it on, right? It's important that it's done. So it's hard to say. I mean, right now the volume is not very high, so it's hard to say how we're going to feel in a couple months. But yeah, I mean, we are going to do everything in our power to make sure we get good responses and timely responses. So
and I'll just brag on this team for a minute too, but this geography team, they have been doing things very similar to this for years and years and years now. So while it is daunting and I'm very happy to not be involved in any way at all, they are super capable and fast. So, and I guess I'm just throw in too, because I think it's relevant, the vast majority of challenges are accepted. We don't get a whole lot of, I think that's kind of a misconception. We don't get a whole lot of people just throwing stuff up against the wall. It's not a super fun process for either side of it. So I don't think people are sitting at home on the weekends like, hey, I'm going to go make up some stuff for the Census Bureau. So the vast majority are, legit. We go research them and there was a problem and there's a change. They're not usually huge changes, but this team can certainly handle it. And they've been doing similar things in different realms. And I guess last time, Jim, do you want to speak? Because how much work was it last decennial?
Sure. We had, I don't know how many cases we had ended up with. It was a couple of thousand total. We ended up reviewing 1.7 million addresses, and that means we had to look at each one of those. And I don't have the figures in front of me. Boy, maybe for Thursday I can put that together. There were some situations where we added addresses into the census, ones that we already had in the stream in the process. It's a big job for us, but we do a thorough job. Dorothy had training last month, and it was a lot of memories about how we go through. We get to see the history of every address. We have a record of every time. Believe it or not, I can tell you this. This is not top secret. We have a record every time somebody went to a house, to an address, and tried to get a response. We have that record. We're not allowed to see the person's names. We're not allowed to see that. But we can look at an address and say, oh, this address was visited. This address was not. This address was non-response follow-up. And so we get into the nitty-gritty about every address. And if it's in our universe, we research the heck out of it. So it's good for us in a lot of ways because we discover issues that we didn't know about. And it's a learning experience, not just for us as geographers, but the agency as well. We start to look at what things that worked well and what didn't. But you'd be surprised in the end how few addresses actually were missed. I make that comment every time we talk about it. It's a very small percentage that we actually miss. Now, we haven't seen 2020 yet, and yes, there were a lot of unique challenges to this census for a couple of reasons. But in the past, we did a really, really amazingly good job, and I'm impressed every time. And I'm not saying that because I'm a census employee. I'm a pretty skeptical person most of the time, as some people know. But I'm impressed with the work we do. Andrew, what else we got?
I got nothing else, but we have some feedback here from folks in the city of Austin and Caldwell County that there is kind of addressing done for these detached units. I would encourage all the folks who are on here who, particularly if y'all do not semi-regularly interact with the Census Bureau, those are the, I know we got folks here from Llano County, Lee County, and some of y'all might be new, might have been around the block, so don't really have any questions, but I just encourage y'all to take advantage of the opportunity. If you have something we haven't covered or, something you want to bring to their attention that's an issue or wish to work on moving forward, this would be a good opportunity.
And that's a great point, Andrew. And, we're not going away. We're going to be at the Texas GIS Forum, right, Lacey? Dorothy and I are going to be there.
The way you
we're going to be talking
sounds
about
more like a threat than an offer, but yeah.
It's kind of a threat. So come out and see us. And our emails, I had them flashing on the screen there for a little bit. We work every day, sometimes from home lately, especially. But we're here. If you have questions, talk to us. One of the reasons we want to do this, we want to make those connections with you. And these are the folks that are out there in Llano County, Caldwell County, and in Bastrop County. Talk to us. Let us know what you're thinking. Ask us questions. Let's develop those relationships. So the next time we get into PSAP, the next time we get into Luca, you're like, Jim, you said this. Come on, what's the case? Or help me understand this better. And then we all get our jobs done better. And that's really what this is partly about. Establishing those long-term relationships. We want to be here to answer your questions. And that goes for the state as well as the regional planning agencies, the counties, and the cities.
Yeah, we like to be a resource for you guys. So I don't, and that sounds sarcastic, but it's not. We love when we get, emails with questions. It keeps our days interesting and keeps us engaged and on our toes. So please never feel weird about emailing us with any weird question you have about census.
We've heard weirder.
Yes, we've heard them all, and we've heard much stranger, I'm sure. So we're happy to help.
I would ask, I mean, so, you know, one of the topics I know that is of top of mind for a lot of folks in the larger cities in this area is that slide I showed showing kind of how different the population estimates wound up from the actual census results. And I, you know, there's a lot in all that, but I would just ask the Census Bureau folks and, you know, anybody who's on the call from those cities, just what do you make of those results?
So I'll touch on it from the census side. So the methodology, you know, especially the further we get away from a decennial census, the harder it is for us to, we start with a base number and we're adding in all these inputs. And then trying to assign them down to these lower levels of geography. So the further we get from the decennial, the harder it can be. It's also much harder in a very rapidly changing population, which is certainly what we have here. I just realized with that, I also forgot to come back to a question you asked earlier about how do we basically assign sub-county population. We do that for the very, very high level answer by using housing unit counts and then assign the number of people, usually based on the county. So it is, you know, it is an estimate. It is based on a mathematical formula. It's only as good as the inputs that we have in it. One of the specific data points that we use very, very heavily is the IRS data. So there are certain populations that the IRS data will miss proportionally, more in proportionally. And then births and deaths as well. So, I mean, those are the main data points we have there. The further we get from the decennial census, the harder it is. And yeah, I can send you the paper on that. But one of the big things we struggle with is if people move and they're not awesomely recorded by the IRS, it's harder for us to track some of those movements too. So time, and then it's just hard to follow people. It really is. I know that sounds like that's why we do and that's really why we do the census in the American Community Survey. An actual sample of actual surveys give us a lot different data. Not a lot. Sometimes it's a lot. It can be different. And you know, we've certainly, with any differences, if anybody from a local government or local municipality wants to talk about it, we can walk through, you know, how we use our inputs and how we create these numbers. I really mean this. It's possible they're high, they're low, whatever it is. And it's just based on methodology. And I'm happy to have those conversations. I think most of the time it gets into specifics for a place, a city or a county. But happy to take general questions here, and then happy to talk specifically with anybody who wants to talk specifically about their place and their population differences.
I don't know what thoughts other folks in the city of Austin have, or Travis County, but I think for Travis County in particular, I think something like, you know, the latest estimates were, you know, much higher than the census count, and a big, I think, close to 75% of our growth is coming from migration, and it's just, we're growing so fast, and it's on a component that's very difficult for us to measure and to track. And so I think that's where some of those discrepancies are coming from. But we really also, I think, just need to be able to double check it, because and I'm grateful for this CQR operation, because it was a challenge census and we're growing really rapidly. And when you bring those two things together, I mean, it just makes it really hard to pin down, you know, what the reality is. It definitely feels like we were growing much faster than what our census count says, you know, but it's a matter of perception, right?
What else?
Hi, this is Jackie Harnster with the City of Austin. So I just wanted to add, I put some comments in the chat. I'm the manager of the addressing group here at the city, and we're the addressing authority for the city and the county. So questions about data specifically, or how we assign addresses, or what your inputs are, be happy to talk to you about that.
So,
Thank you. Well, I'm
Jim,
taking note of that.
so Jim, can you maybe tell us a little bit of your working relationship with the housing unit folks at the Census Bureau? Because like we know some of our departments submit monthly surveys with those housing unit counts and the permitting data. And so I'm just wondering like how you guys work together to kind of fill in some of that information to kind of figure out, internally, the different parties that are sending information to you and kind of making sense of it, internally when we get it to you so that you guys can kind of have a whole picture, holistic picture.
Well, before I try to answer that, let me say that there are some censuses and surveys. I should say censuses. I know there are some surveys that are conducted that do not use the master address file. There are a lot fewer now than there used to be. But I do know there are some that they use an external source or a different source of housing unit information. For those processes that do use the main source of housing unit information, it comes from the MAF, the master address file. And there are a wide variety of programs and outreach efforts that I mentioned earlier that build on that. It produces what we would call as a live picture of, we call it live tiger, and it's just kind of a phrase for a snapshot of the current condition of the MAF Tiger database, and that includes the geographic infrastructure as well as the address and housing unit infrastructure. And without getting into too much detail that can't directly answer your question, one thing to understand is that while we have features in Tiger that represents roads and addresses, we also have points in Tiger that represent the locations of individual addresses, and they're not always equatable to a housing unit, and there are some vagaries associated with that. But it's an ongoing process. When a survey wants to leverage information from Tiger to conduct a sample, they have a specific set of criteria that defines what a housing unit is, and that's not always the same. There are slight variations in the definition of housing unit between decennial and some surveys. So I don't know much more than that, and I'm certainly not able to talk any more about that. I don't know if Lacey has more information to add.
So Lila, I think the answer is they don't. I don't think we do work. So when like SOC, when we get permit information from, and I'm totally blanking on like the name of it. We have a lot, but we have a lot of different surveys that are basically administrative records. We're asking from the county or the city about how many permits, how many occupancy, certificates of occupancy. Those are numbers. I don't think they get down to a place where we ingest those in any deeper, more meaningful way through MAF, Tiger, any of that kind of stuff. So I think the way that we get those, we do have some ongoing surveys that do collect in areas that we've identified where we don't have a good housing list. I think we still run DOL, which I can't remember that name either, but we have some surveys that are specifically set up for that. But as far as like your building permits and things like that, different administrative records we request from different governments every month, those do not directly feed into or are not directly aligned with anything that the geography team is doing, to the best of my knowledge. And I don't think we even accept enough information to, I don't think it's that detailed. Somebody has to have a different question. We can't end on that one. That was a downer. Or have to come up with something else.
Which region of Texas has the best barbecue?
Don't make eye contact, anybody. Don't make eye contact. We were actually just talking about the Salt Lick the other day.
What?
Central Texas. I'm biased. I live here, but I'm biased.
Dorothy, you're a native Texan, right?
Yeah, but don't ask me. I'm a vegan.
Okay.
I would know.
Well, Andrew, that's what we've got, man.
Well, let me just thank you all for participating and tacitly agreeing that Central Texas, the CAPCOG region, has the best barbecue in the state and therefore the world.
You can quote me on that.
We really appreciate you. We really appreciate y'all taking the time to be with us, and I appreciate everybody on the call who took the time this afternoon to learn a little bit and interact with our staff from the Census Bureau, who obviously do a lot of work to make sure that we get good information about who lives here and what's going on in our communities. So as Jim said, this is not your only opportunity to interact with these folks. They are available, and this was sort of an opportunity for us to cover a lot of ground all at once, particularly on the heels of the most recent census. But we'll be in touch. And I guess with that, any follow-up questions, please send them to me, or and I can forward them to Census Bureau staff. Otherwise, we'll see y'all when we see you.
Thanks, guys. Thank you for hosting.
Thanks for hosting CAPCOG.
Yeah.
Have a good day.